Chapter 1. The Discovery Horus walked the corridors of the Imperial Palace with the measured pace of a conqueror coming home. 200 years of war had taught him to read the weight of silence, and the silence that followed him through these halls was different now than it had been even a decade before. Heavier, the kind that settled into stone and stayed there. He had returned to Terra not for ceremony or council, but for the mundane business of requisitions and strategic reports that even a war master could not delegate entirely. The Emperor had retreated deeper into his work beneath the palace, emerging less and less frequently for the affairs of the Great Crusade. Malcador handled the administrative details now, as he had always done, but with an efficiency that seemed almost eager to conclude. The thought bothered him in a way he could not name, my lord. The custodian at the entrance to Malcador's administrative quarters inclined his head. The regent awaits you in the tertiary archive. Horus nodded and passed through, his footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceiling. The tertiary archive was not where he had expected to find Malcador. It was a place for storing records that mattered little to current operations, historical documents, lineage charts, the kind of bureaucratic detritus that accumulated over centuries of administration. Strange that Malcador would choose to conduct their meeting here. He found the sigillite standing before a wall of sealed data vaults, his back to the entrance. Something in his posture, the slight forward lean, the way his hands were clasped behind him, suggested a man deep in contemplation of uncomfortable truths. "War Master," Malcador said, without turning. "Your timing is impeccable. I have been reviewing some historical perspectives on our current situation." Historical perspectives? Horus approached slowly, his warrior's instincts picking up something in Malcador's tone that did not quite match the casual words. What manner of history requires such security protocols? Malcador's laugh was dry, brittle. The kind that shapes the future, my lord. The kind that explains the present. He turned then, and Horus saw something in the ancient man's eyes that he had never seen before. Regret, perhaps, or the weight of knowledge that had grown too heavy to carry alone. "I am departing Terra again within the week," Malcador continued. "There are preparations to be made, contingencies to establish. The Emperor's work progresses toward a critical juncture, and when that juncture arrives, certain protocols will need to be in place." The words were measured, careful. Too careful. "What protocols?" Horus asked. "Administrative ones, mostly. Personnel transitions. The kind of tedious organizational work that follows the completion of any great endeavor." Malcador gestured toward one of the sealed vaults. "I have been compiling the relevant documentation. Perhaps you would find it illuminating to review some of the historical precedents for such transitions." Horus looked at the vault Malcador had indicated. It was sealed with a bio-lock, keyed to the highest levels of imperial authority. Himself, the Emperor, Malcador, few others. What kind of precedents? Oh, the Thunder Warriors primarily. Fascinating case study in organizational life cycle management. The transition from the Unification Wars to the Great Crusade required certain adjustments to personnel structure. Very clean process, all things considered. Very necessary. The casual tone did not match the words. Horus had fought beside Thunder Warriors in the final campaigns on Terra. He remembered their strength, their ferocity, their absolute loyalty to the Emperor. He also remembered when they had simply disappeared, quietly, efficiently, after the last enemy had fallen and their purpose had been fulfilled. Why would I need to review those records? Because patterns repeat, War Master. Because the successful completion of one phase of a great work often requires the careful management of resources that were essential to that phase, but are less optimal for the next. Malkador moved toward the vault's control interface. I am authorizing temporary access to these files for your review, in case certain decisions need to be made in my absence. The bioscanner accepted Malkador's authorization, and the vault unsealed with a soft pneumatic hiss. Inside, Horus could see data slates organized with the meticulous precision that characterized all of Malkador's work. The topmost slate bore a label that made his blood still. Project Thunder's End. Precedent Analysis. I will leave you to your review, Malkador said, his voice carefully neutral. I expect these files will provide the context you need for understanding the administrative challenges ahead. He paused at the archive entrance. War Master, the Emperor values your strategic mind above all others. That is why I am trusting you with this material. When the time comes to make difficult decisions for the good of the Imperium, I know you will make them correctly. The door sealed behind him with a finality that seemed deliberate. Horus stood alone in the archive, staring at the open vault. Every instinct he had developed over 2 centuries of war was screaming at him that whatever lay in those files would change everything, that opening them would cross a threshold he could not return from. He reached for the topmost data slate. The first page was a summary analysis comparing resource allocation efficiency between Phase 1 personnel, Thunder Warriors, and Phase 2 personnel, Primarchs and Astartes. The language was clinical, bureaucratic. The Thunder Warriors were described as optimized for limited operational parameters, with acceptable degradation patterns over projected service life cycle. The Primarchs were noted as enhanced intellectual capabilities, permitting extended operational deployment, but with inherent design limitations requiring management protocols upon strategic objective completion. Design limitations. Management protocols. Horus scrolled deeper into the document. The next section was titled Precedent Analysis, Thunder Warrior Transition Methodology. It described, in exhaustive detail, the process by which the Thunder Warriors had been systematically eliminated after the Unification Wars, not through combat casualties, through deliberate termination protocols. Medical procedures disguised as routine maintenance, isolated deployments from which they had not returned, all authorized by the Emperor, all coordinated by Malkador, all justified by strategic necessity. His hands were shaking now. The data slate felt like a weapon pointed at his heart. The final section was labeled Phase 3 Transition Protocols, Preliminary Framework. It opened with a single line that made the world tilt beneath his feet. Upon successful completion of galactic reunification objectives, transition from transhuman governance structure to human administrative control will require careful management of Phase 2 personnel redundancy. Phase 2. Personnel redundancy. The Primarchs. Him. His brothers. They were planning to kill them. Horus set the slate down with hands that trembled, despite 2 centuries of martial discipline. The archive felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner. He had walked into this room as the favored son of the Emperor, the war master of a great crusade to reunite humanity. He was leaving it as a tool that had served its purpose and was now being catalogued for disposal. The Emperor had created them to conquer the galaxy. And when the galaxy was conquered, the Emperor would destroy them, just as he had destroyed the Thunder Warriors, just as he would destroy anything that stood between him and his vision of human hegemony. His father, no, not his father, his creator, his employer, the being who had shaped him into a weapon and would discard him when a weapon was no longer needed. Horus closed the vault with movements that felt disconnected from his body. The biolock sealed automatically, but he knew he could access these files again whenever he needed to. Malcador had made sure of that, had wanted him to find them, had wanted him to understand what was coming. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The corridors of the palace felt different as he walked back through them. The silence that had seemed heavy with history now felt heavy with judgment. The custodians he passed were not guards. They were wardens. The servants were not attending to the needs of the Imperium's ruling class. They were maintaining facilities for prisoners who did not yet know they were condemned. By the time he reached his private chambers, one thing had settled into certainty. He was not going to die quietly for the convenience of the Emperor's long-term strategic planning. Neither were his brothers. The question now was how to warn them without triggering the very termination protocols that Malcador had so carefully prepared. The answer to that question would require very careful thought indeed. Chapter 2. The burden of truth sleep would not come. Horus lay in the darkness of his private chambers, staring at the ceiling, while his mind worked through implications like a blade through flesh. 3 hours had passed since he left the archive, and the weight of what he had discovered had only grown heavier. Project Thunder's end. The clinical precision of those words kept echoing in his thoughts. Not the Thunder Warrior Wars, not the Thunder Warrior campaign, the Thunder Warrior end. As if their termination had been the goal from the beginning, not a regrettable necessity. He sat up, activating the chamber's data interface with a gesture. If Malcador had wanted him to understand the full scope of what was planned, then he needed to understand what had come before. The Thunder Warriors were not ancient history. Many of the veterans who had served alongside them were still alive, still serving in various capacities throughout the Imperium. Their memories could be cross-referenced with Imperial records, if those records still existed, if they had ever existed in anything other than sanitized form. The first files he accessed were standard historical archives, the official record of the Unification Wars. The Thunder Warriors were described in glowing terms: loyal, fierce, instrumental in bringing terror under the Emperor's rule. Their service records ended with a simple notation: transferred to reserve status upon completion of Unification objectives. Reserve status. Horus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had never met a Thunder Warrior in reserve status. No one had. He dug deeper, accessing military personnel databases that required War Master-level authorization. The individual service records for Thunder Warriors showed a pattern that became more disturbing the more closely he examined it. Medical evaluations noting genetic instability requiring ongoing monitoring, reassignments to isolated positions, final disposition codes that were maddeningly vague, and then, abruptly, they simply stopped. Thousands of records ending within a span of months, not with deaths in battle, with medical discharges, transfers to specialized facilities, and administrative notations that explained nothing while explaining everything. Specialized facilities that had no location data, medical discharges signed by physicians whose names appeared nowhere else in Imperial records. Administrative transfers approved by authorities who had, apparently, left no other documentation of their existence. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew how to read it. Systematic elimination, disguised as bureaucratic routine. Horus leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of revelation pressing down on him like the gravity of a dead star. The Emperor had not simply allowed the Thunder Warriors to fade away. He had orchestrated their disappearance with the same methodical precision that characterized all his great works. A memory surfaced unbidden, something he hadn't thought about for decades, but which now seemed burning with significance. He had been young then, barely a century into his service as War Master, when the last of the Second Legion had been recalled to Terra. He remembered asking the Emperor about it, concerned that one of his brother Primarchs had fallen in some catastrophic battle. "Their purpose is concluded," the Emperor had said, his attention focused on the strategic displays that surrounded his throne. "Their resources will be redistributed where they can serve more effectively. Their purpose is concluded. Not their mission, not their campaign. Their purpose, as if they had been created for a specific function, and, that function complete, could simply be redistributed." Horus had pressed for more information. What had happened to his brother? Where were the warriors of the Second Legion being reassigned? The Emperor had turned to look at him then, and the weight of that gaze had been enough to end the conversation. "Some questions serve no useful purpose, my son. This is one of them." At the time, Horus had accepted the dismissal. The Emperor's wisdom was beyond question, his strategic vision beyond the comprehension of even his Primarchs. If the Second Legion's fate was not something Horus needed to know, then it was not something he needed to know. Now, in the darkness of his chambers with Malcador's files burned into his memory, that acceptance felt like the most naive thing he had ever done. The Second Legion had not been redistributed. They had been eliminated, erased so thoroughly that even their existence had become a matter of administrative notation rather than historical fact. And when Horus had come too close to asking the right questions, the Emperor had used the weight of his authority to end the inquiry. Just as he would end Horus when the time came. He accessed another set of files. Genetic analysis reports from the creation of the Primarchs. These were heavily classified, requiring multiple authentication protocols, but his access codes opened them without resistance. Malcador had been thorough in his preparations. The reports were fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. The Emperor had not simply created 20 superior beings to lead his crusade. He had created 20 superior beings with carefully engineered flaws. Genetic kill switches, the files called them. Biological vulnerabilities that could be exploited if the need arose. Angron's neural implants, described as an unfortunate byproduct of his discovery circumstances, were actually noted as a fortuitous development permitting direct cranial intervention if behavioral modification becomes necessary. Conrad Kurz's visions and psychological instability were not tragic flaws, but designed stress factors intended to maintain psychological dependency on Imperial support structures. Magnus's pursuit of psychic knowledge was described as an acceptable risk given the subject's utility during the expansion phase, with established protocols for containment in the event of corruption. Each of his brothers, each of them, was described not as a son, but as a weapon with built-in safeguards, tools designed to be useful during the Great Crusade and disposable afterward. Horus scrolled through his own genetic analysis with hands that had begun to tremble despite his best efforts at control. His file was extensive, detailed, coldly analytical. Subject exhibits optimal leadership capabilities combined with strong emotional attachment to authority figures. Loyalty protocols deeply embedded in psychological architecture. Recommended for extended deployment as primary command asset. Note: subject's emotional dependency on parental approval represents potential leverage point for behavioral control if operational parameters require modification. Emotional dependency on parental approval. They had built his need for the Emperor's approval into his very genetics, turned his loyalty into a weapon that could be used against him. And when that loyalty was no longer useful, when the galaxy was conquered and the Emperor no longer needed a war master, those same genetic levers could be used to ensure his compliance with his own termination. The data interface chimed softly, indicating an incoming communication. Horus closed the files hastily and accepted the connection. Malcador's face appeared in the projection, his expression unreadable in the dim light of what appeared to be his private study. "War Master, I trust your review of the files has been illuminating." "It has been educational," Horus replied, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "I appreciate the historical context." "Historical context is important," Malcador agreed. "It helps us understand patterns, identify precedents, plan for similar situations that may arise in the future." There was something in the way he said it, a weight, a significance, that made Horus's skin crawl. Similar situations. Oh yes, the Emperor's work proceeds through phases, as you have seen. Each phase requires different tools, different approaches, different personnel. The transition between phases is always delicate. It requires careful planning and flawless execution. Malcador leaned forward slightly, and his eyes seemed to bore through the projection field directly into Horus's soul. "The Emperor values your strategic mind above all others, War Master. When the time comes to plan the next transition, he will rely on your judgment to ensure it proceeds as smoothly as the last one." The connection ended abruptly, leaving Horus staring at empty air. The message was clear. They expected him to help plan his own termination, to be complicit in the elimination of his brothers, to use his strategic genius to make their deaths as efficient and comprehensive as the Thunder Warriors had been. They expected him to be the architect of his own execution. Horus sat in the darkness for a long time after that, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the weight of it settle into him, the way cold settles into stone. The Emperor had created him to be the perfect weapon, the ideal son, the loyal tool who would never question and never resist. But they had made one critical error in his design. They had given him a strategic mind capable of seeing patterns, analyzing threats, and planning responses. And now that mind was focused entirely on the problem of how to survive what was coming, the first step was simple. He needed to know more. If he was going to save himself and his brothers, he needed to understand the full scope of the threat they faced. The second step would be more complex. He needed to determine which of his brothers could be trusted with the truth, and which ones would react in ways that might trigger the very termination protocols he was trying to avoid. The third step was the most dangerous. He would need to find a way to turn the Emperor's own strategic planning against him. It would require careful thought, meticulous preparation, perfect execution. But he was, after all, the War Master. Strategic planning was what he had been designed to do, even if, in this case, he was planning a war against his own creator. Chapter 3. First Contact. The vengeful spirit drifted in the void between stars, its running lights the only interruption to the perfect darkness that surrounded them. Horus had ordered the ship to a holding position in an uninhabited system, far from any Imperial monitoring stations or patrol routes. What he needed to discuss with Sanguinius required absolute privacy, the kind that could only be found in the deep void where no one could overhear and no records would be kept. Sanguinius arrived precisely when summoned, as he always did. The angel's presence filled the observation deck of Horus's private quarters like light filling a room, and for a moment Horus felt the familiar comfort of his brother's company. Sanguinius had always been the one he turned to when the burden of command grew too heavy, the one whose counsel he valued above all others, save perhaps Rogel Dawn's tactical expertise. Now he was about to place a burden on those golden shoulders that might break even an angel. "Brother," Sanguinius said, extending his hand in greeting. The gesture was warm, genuine, carrying the weight of 2 centuries of shared campaigns and mutual respect. Your message spoke of urgent matters requiring discretion. You know you have my attention." Horus gripped the offered hand, feeling the familiar strength there, the unshakable certainty that had made Sanguinius such an effective leader during the most desperate moments of the Great Crusade. In another few minutes, that certainty would be shattered forever. "Walk with me," Horus said, leading his brother to the observation bay that looked out into the starfield. "What I am about to tell you will change everything between us and our Father. Once you know it, there will be no unknowing it." Something in his tone must have communicated the gravity of the situation, because Sanguinius's expression shifted from casual warmth to focused attention. The angel had always been perceptive, able to read the currents of emotion and intention that flowed beneath the surface of any conversation. "I have discovered something," Horus continued, "about the Emperor's plans for us, for all of us." "What manner of plans?" Horus activated a privacy field around the observation bay, ensuring that no recording devices or listening mechanisms could penetrate their conversation. The faint hum of the field generator seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Do you remember the Thunder Warriors, Sanguinius?" The angel's perfect features creased in thought. "Of course. They served with distinction during the Unification Wars, elite warriors, utterly loyal to the Emperor. Do you remember what happened to them after the wars ended?" "They were—" Sanguinius paused, and something flickered across his face, a moment of uncertainty. As if he had been about to give an answer, he suddenly realized he did not actually know. "They were transferred to other duties, were they not? Assigned to garrison positions?" "No," Horus said quietly. "They were eliminated, all of them. Systematically, methodically, efficiently. Medical procedures disguised as routine care, isolated deployments from which they never returned, administrative transfers to facilities that existed only on paper." Sanguinius was very still now, his luminous eyes fixed on Horus's face with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to examine the truth beneath. That is not possible. The Emperor would never. The Emperor ordered it. Malcador coordinated it. Every single Thunder Warrior who survived the Unification Wars was murdered in the months following their victory. Horus pulled out the data slate he had brought from Malcador's archive, its screen displaying the clinical documentation of Project Thunder's End. "I have the records, brother. The complete operational details of their termination." Sanguinius took the data slate with hands that were not quite steady. His eyes moved across the text with the speed of superhuman cognition, absorbing and processing information that would have taken a baseline human hours to comprehend. With each line, his expression grew darker, more stricken, until by the time he reached the end, his face was as pale as marble. This cannot be authentic. Someone has fabricated these documents to sow discord. Read the authentication codes. Check the biometric verification. Cross-reference the medical records with Imperial archives. Horus's voice was gentle but implacable. "I spent 3 days doing exactly that. Every detail is accurate. Every signature is genuine. Every authorization comes from the highest levels of Imperial authority." Sanguinius set the data slate down with deliberate care, as if it were a weapon that might explode if handled roughly. He turned back to the observation bay, staring out at the stars with eyes that seemed to see something terrible written in their light. "They served loyally," the angel said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "They gave everything for his vision of unified humanity, and he repaid that service with death. Because they were no longer useful, because their purpose was complete and they represented a potential threat to the next phase of his plans. Horus moved to stand beside his brother, both of them looking out into the void. Now ask yourself, what happens when our purpose is complete? What happens when the galaxy is conquered, and the Emperor no longer needs Primarchs to lead his armies? The silence stretched between them like a blade. When Sanguinius finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the future and found it wanting. He cannot mean to. We are his sons. Are we? Or are we weapons he created for a specific purpose? Horus pulled out a second data slate, this one containing the genetic analysis files he had discovered. Our flaws are not accidents, Sanguinius. They are designed vulnerabilities, kill switches built into our very genetics. Your thirst for blood, your episodes of rage, they are not tragic failings. They are control mechanisms. Sanguinius took the second slate with hands that trembled despite his superhuman self-control. As he read, something fundamental seemed to break in his expression. The serene confidence that had always been his defining characteristic, cracking like a perfect statue, struck by an invisible hammer. The red thirst, he breathed. He knew. He always knew what it would become, what it would do to my sons. And he allowed it because it made us controllable. Every legion has its weakness. Every Primarch has his flaw, all carefully engineered to ensure that when the time comes, we can be eliminated as efficiently as the Thunder Warriors were. Sanguinius was quiet for a long time, his luminous eyes fixed on something invisible in the darkness beyond the observation bay. When he finally turned back to Horus, his face was set in lines of terrible resolve. "Have you told anyone else?" "No. I needed to be certain I could trust you before proceeding further." "And now?" "Now I need to decide which of our brothers can be trusted with this knowledge, and which ones would react in ways that might trigger the very termination protocols we are trying to avoid." Horus gestured toward the data slates. "Some of them will refuse to believe it. Others will want to confront the Emperor immediately. Damn the consequences. And some," Sanguinius said quietly, "will decide that cooperation with the Emperor's plans is the only way to preserve whatever can be preserved." The weight of that possibility settled between them like a stone. Not all of their brothers would choose resistance when faced with this truth. Some would calculate that survival lay in compliance, in helping to orchestrate their own destruction in exchange for mercy that would never come. "What do you propose?" Sanguinius asked. "Careful recruitment. We approach only those we are certain can be trusted, and only when we have ironclad evidence to present. We build our alliance slowly, methodically, without triggering any of the monitoring systems that undoubtedly watch for exactly this kind of irregular coordination among Primarchs." Sanguinius nodded slowly. "Guilliman, certainly. His analytical mind will appreciate the evidence, and his loyalty to his own sons will outweigh his loyalty to the Emperor when he understands what is at stake. Vulcan as well. His compassion for humanity extends to protecting those he considers family. Dawn will be more difficult. His sense of duty runs deeper than almost anyone's. But his duty is to the Imperium, not necessarily to the Emperor personally. If we can frame this properly, as protecting the Imperium from the destabilizing effects of sudden leadership transitions, he might be persuaded." They spent the next hour discussing their brothers, analyzing personalities and loyalties with the cold precision of generals planning a campaign. Because that was what this was, Horus realized, a campaign for survival against the being who had created them to be the perfect soldiers, in a war that would end with their own destruction. "There is one thing more we must consider," Sanguinius said, as their planning drew to a close. If the Emperor has planned our termination so carefully, he has certainly planned for the possibility that we might discover his intentions. There will be contingencies, fail-safes, protocols designed to accelerate our elimination if we show signs of resistance. Horus felt cold certainty settle into his bones. Malcador's conversation with me, the way he made sure I found the files. This may not have been an accident. A trap or a test to see how we would react to the knowledge, to identify which of us would accept our fate and which would resist. The implications unfolded in his mind like the petals of a poisonous flower. They may be watching us right now, waiting to see who I contact, how the knowledge spreads. Sanguinius was silent for a moment, then laughed, a sound like bitter crystal breaking. Then we must be very careful indeed, brother, because if they are testing us, we have already failed simply by having this conversation. The vengeful spirit continued its drift through the void, two Primarchs standing in its observation bay, with the weight of terrible knowledge pressing down on them like the gravity of a collapsing star. They had crossed a line from which there could be no return, transformed from loyal sons to conspirators against their own creator. And somewhere in the depths of the imperial palace on Terra, Horus was certain. Sensors were recording their every movement, every communication, every deviation from the patterns of loyalty that had defined their existence for 2 centuries. The war for their survival had already begun. They just had to hope they could stay ahead of it long enough to save themselves and their brothers from the fate that the Emperor had always intended for them. The fate of every tool that had outlived its usefulness. Chapter 4. The Web of Lies. The Phalanx held station in Terra's orbital defense grid, its massive bulk casting shadows across the Imperial Palace below. Rogel Dawn stood in his private study, reviewing the architectural schematics for the latest expansion to the palace's fortification network, when the secure Vox chimed with an incoming transmission from his brothers. "Rogel," Horus's voice carried the weight of careful formality that meant sensitive matters were to be discussed. "Sanguinius and I require your expertise on a matter of palace security. Can you meet us aboard the Phalanx within the hour?" Dawn set aside his work without question. When the War Master requested consultation on security matters, particularly with Sanguinius present, it meant imperial-level concerns that required immediate attention. He had been expecting such a call. The Emperor's increasing withdrawal from the day-to-day operations of the Great Crusade had created administrative gaps that the Primarchs were having to fill more frequently. Horus and Sanguinius arrived precisely on schedule, but something in their demeanor immediately set Dawn's tactical instincts on edge. They moved with the careful precision of warriors entering potentially hostile territory, their eyes tracking the positions of his household guards and noting exit routes. It was the behavior of men who had learned to suspect surveillance even among allies. "Brothers," Dawn greeted them in his private study, activating the chamber's anti-surveillance protocols as a matter of routine. "What security concerns require such discretion?" Horus and Sanguinius exchanged a look that carried volumes of unspoken communication. Finally, Horus spoke, his voice carrying the weight of terrible certainty. "We need to show you something, Rogel. But first, we need to access areas of the Imperial Palace that are restricted even to most Primarchs, areas that only your architectural authority can reach." Dawn's expression remained neutral, but internally his analytical mind began cataloguing possibilities. There were indeed sections of the palace that he alone could access, sub-levels, foundations, structural spaces that existed between the official architecture. His role as the palace's chief architect had granted him knowledge of systems and chambers that appeared on no maps available to others. What manner of areas? The deep laboratories beneath the gene forges, Sanguinius said quietly. The ones that exist below even the Mechanicum facilities. We believe there are research stations there that no one is supposed to know about. The specificity of the request triggered warning signals in Dawn's mind. Those laboratories did exist. He had designed the structural supports for them personally, working from specifications provided directly by the Emperor. They were listed in his architectural records as specialized research facilities, imperial authority only, with access protocols so restricted that even he had never seen their interiors. Those facilities require the highest level of clearance codes beyond even Primarch authority. But not beyond architectural necessity, Horus said. If there were a structural emergency, a potential collapse, you would need immediate access to assess the integrity of the supporting systems. Dawn looked between his brothers, reading the tension in their postures, the careful way they were framing their request. They were asking him to abuse his architectural authority to gain unauthorized access to imperial facilities. Under normal circumstances, he would have refused immediately and reported the request through proper channels. But these were not normal circumstances. Something in their manner, in the weight of unspoken knowledge they carried, suggested that the unauthorized access was itself authorized by information they had not yet shared with him. What do you expect to find in those laboratories? Instead of answering directly, Horus pulled out a data slate and handed it to him. Read this first, then decide if the risk is justified. The files were extensive, detailed, and absolutely horrifying. Dawn read through the documentation of Project Thunder's End with the methodical precision that characterized all his analysis, cross-referencing the data against his own memories of the period and finding every detail disturbingly accurate. The genetic analysis files that followed were even more troubling. Clinical descriptions of engineered vulnerabilities in beings he had considered his brothers for 2 centuries. When he finished reading, he set the data slate down and was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications with the same systematic approach he would use to analyze a fortress under siege. If these files are authentic, he said finally, then every strategic assessment I have ever made regarding the long-term stability of the Imperium has been based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions. They are authentic, Sanguinius assured him. We have verified every authentication code, every biometric signature. The documentation is genuine. Then we are not sons, Dawn said, his voice carrying the flat finality of a man stating an architectural specification. We are weapons with expiration dates. Weapons that need to be properly disposed of when their usefulness ends, Horus added. And we believe the facilities beneath the gene forges may contain the tools intended for that disposal. Dawn stood and moved to his personal access terminal, his fingers dancing across the interface with practiced efficiency. If such tools exist, they would require specialized containment and security measures. The structural modifications I designed for those deep levels included provisions for extreme isolation protocols, the kind used for weaponized biological agents or experimental technologies too dangerous for standard containment. The terminal displayed a 3-dimensional schematic of the Imperial Palace's subterranean levels, highlighting a complex of chambers far below even the deepest Mechanicum workshops. Dawn's architectural logs showed them as reinforced laboratories with independent life support systems and electromagnetic shielding that would prevent any signals from entering or leaving. Emergency structural inspection, Dawn murmured, entering the authorization codes that would grant them immediate access. Potential Foundation instability, requiring immediate assessment by the chief architect and specialist consultants. The authorization went through without challenge. Within minutes, they were descending through access shafts that appeared on no maps, following maintenance corridors that existed only in Dawn's architectural memory. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, not just from the weight of stone above them, but from a sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the very air. The laboratories they found were pristine, sterile, and active. Banks of genetic analysis equipment hummed with quiet efficiency, processing samples that glowed with an unsettling luminescence. Data displays showed gene sequence modifications, protein synthesis rates, and toxicity assessments that made Dawn's enhanced physiology recoil instinctively. Controlled termination events, Sanguinius read from one of the active displays, his voice hollow with horror. Genetic cascade failures. Targeted organ shutdown protocols. Horus was examining another workstation, his face growing paler with each line of data he read. These are not theoretical studies. Look at the test subjects. Genetic samples labeled with Primarch designations. Dawn moved to a secured storage vault and entered his emergency access codes. Inside, arranged with clinical precision, were vials of genetically modified pathogens, each one labeled with a Roman numeral. His own number, 7, was prominently displayed on a rack of samples that pulsed with an ominous green light. Airborne delivery systems, he read from the attached documentation. Targeted genetic markers. Estimated time to complete system failure, 4 to 6 hours post-exposure. The 3 Primarchs stood in the sterile laboratory, surrounded by the tools of their own planned destruction, and felt the weight of ultimate betrayal settle into their bones. These were not contingency plans or theoretical studies. These were production-ready biological weapons, tailored specifically to kill each of them with surgical precision. "How long have these facilities been operational?" Dawn asked, his analytical mind still working despite the emotional devastation. Horus checked the timestamps on the active projects. "Since the beginning of the Great Crusade, they have been refining these weapons for 200 years, perfecting them as they learned more about our individual physiologies." "Every medical examination," Sanguinius said with dawning horror, "every health assessment, every tissue sample taken for routine analysis. It was all data collection for this project." Dawn moved to another workstation and began accessing the facility's research logs. What he found there was even more disturbing than the weapons themselves. "The Emperor's withdrawal to the Webway project," he said, reading from the files. "It is not just to create a new method of faster-than-light travel. The timeline here shows it as Phase 2 of the Imperial Transition Plan. When the Webway is complete, humanity will no longer need the warp for travel. And when humanity no longer needs the warp, we become obsolete," Horus finished. "Our genetic heritage from the Emperor's bargain with the Chaos Gods becomes a liability rather than an asset. The timeline projects completion of the Webway project within 50 years, Dawn continued reading. Initiation of Phase 2 termination protocols is scheduled to begin immediately upon successful implementation. 50 years. It sounded like a long time, but Dawn's strategic mind was already calculating the implications. 50 years to complete the Great Crusade, establish stable imperial governance across the galaxy, and transition from transhuman leadership to purely human administration. 50 years to tie up all the loose ends that the Primarchs represented, including the Primarchs themselves. "We need to understand the full scope of their preparations," Dawn said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a fortress commander assessing a siege. "If they have planned our termination this thoroughly, they have certainly planned for the possibility of our resistance." They spent the next 2 hours systematically downloading every file they could access, copying research data, weapon specifications, and operational timelines. The picture that emerged was one of meticulous preparation spanning centuries, with contingency plans nested within contingency plans. When they finally emerged from the deep laboratories, The three Primarchs were fundamentally changed. They had entered as loyal sons investigating troubling rumors. They emerged as confirmed targets of an assassination program that had been in development since before they had taken their first breaths. "What are our tactical options?" Dawn asked as they made their way back to his study. "Limited," Horus replied grimly. "We cannot confront the Emperor directly. That would trigger immediate activation of the termination protocols. We cannot flee. There is nowhere in the galaxy beyond the reach of Imperial authority. We cannot remain passive. The timeline shows our deaths are inevitable, regardless of our actions." "Then we must change the parameters of the engagement," Dawn said, his fortress builder instincts asserting themselves. "If we cannot avoid the conflict, we must ensure we enter it from a position of strength rather than weakness." "Which means expanding our alliance," Sanguinius added. "Carefully, methodically, but decisively. We need enough of our brothers on our side to make our termination a strategic impossibility rather than an administrative convenience." Dawn nodded, already beginning to calculate force ratios and strategic positions. "Who do we approach next?" "Guilliman," Horus said without hesitation. "His analytical mind will appreciate the evidence, and his administrative capabilities will be essential for coordinating any resistance effort." "Vulcan," Sanguinius added. "His loyalty to his sons and his sense of justice will overcome his loyalty to the Emperor when he understands what is planned." "Ferrus Manus," Dawn contributed. "His technical expertise could be crucial for developing countermeasures to the biological weapons we discovered." As they planned, each Primarch felt the weight of irrevocable change settling over them. They had crossed from investigation to active conspiracy, from loyal sons to rebels planning resistance against their creator. The familiar bonds of duty and familial loyalty had been replaced by something harder, but more honest: the cold calculation of warriors fighting for survival. The Emperor had created them to be the perfect tools for conquering the galaxy. But he had made one critical error in their design. He had given them minds capable of strategic analysis and the will to use those minds for self-preservation. Now they would turn those capabilities against him and discover whether the students had learned enough to defeat their master. The real war for the future of the Imperium had begun, fought not against Xenos threats or human rebels, but between a father and his sons over the fundamental question of who deserved to survive the victory they had all worked to achieve. Chapter 5. Brothers in Shadow. The Conclave met in a place that did not officially exist, a derelict space station in the outer rim of the Sol system, beyond the reach of standard Imperial monitoring, but close enough to Terra that 3 Primarchs could attend without arousing suspicion about their whereabouts. Horus had chosen the location carefully, a facility that had been abandoned during the early expansion of the Great Crusade and forgotten by Imperial records. Guilliman arrived first, as was his habit. The Lord of Ultramar disliked inefficiency in all its forms, and late arrivals to critical meetings ranked high among his personal irritations. He stood in the station's central chamber, reviewing the data slate that Horus had transmitted with the invitation, his analytical mind already working through the implications of what he was reading. Vulcan came next, his massive frame filling the chamber entrance with warmth that seemed to emanate from his very presence. The Salamander's Primarch carried himself with the careful gentleness of someone who knew his own strength and chose to use it only for protection. His dark eyes found Guilliman immediately, and something in his expression suggested he had also been reviewing the transmitted materials. Ferrus Manus was the last to arrive, but his entrance was preceded by the sound of his mechanical hands adjusting systems throughout the station: life support optimization, gravity calibration, security protocols. Where other Primarchs might have accepted the environment as they found it, The Iron Hand's Primarch instinctively improved whatever technology he encountered. "Brothers," Horus said, activating the chamber's anti-surveillance systems as the others settled into position around the central display table. "Thank you for coming. What we discuss here will determine the survival of our bloodlines." "I have reviewed your materials," Guilliman said without preamble, his voice carrying the measured precision of someone delivering a tactical analysis. "The authentication protocols appear genuine, but the implications are difficult to accept. You are asking us to believe that the Emperor has planned our systematic elimination from the earliest days of the Great Crusade." "Not asking," Dawn corrected quietly. "Demonstrating. The evidence speaks for itself." Vulcan looked between his brothers, his expression troubled. "I have spent the past 3 days attempting to find alternative explanations for these files. Some form of contingency planning that could be misinterpreted. Theoretical studies that were never intended for implementation." He paused, Bohanot his massive hands clenching and unclenching in a gesture that spoke of internal struggle. "I have found none. The documentation is too specific, too detailed, too operational for anything other than active planning." "The biological weapons concern me most," Ferrus Manus said, his mechanical fingers manipulating a data slate with inhuman precision. "The genetic markers described in these termination protocols could only have been developed with extensive tissue sampling from each of us, which means this research has been ongoing for the entire duration of our service." Guilliman activated the chamber's central display, calling up the files that detailed Project Thunder's end. "The Thunder Warrior precedent establishes clear methodology. Post-conflict elimination of specialized military assets when their strategic value is superseded by political considerations." "They were not assets," Vulcan said, his voice carrying a note of deep pain. "They were warriors who served with honor, human beings who trusted in the Emperor's vision of unified humanity." "As are we," Sanguinius added quietly, "or as we believed ourselves to be." Ferrus Manus was studying the technical specifications for the anti-Primarch weapons with the focused intensity that characterized his approach to any complex mechanism. These delivery systems are sophisticated, airborne pathogens designed to exploit our enhanced respiratory efficiency, contact toxins that penetrate our augmented skin, neurological disruptors calibrated to our specific brain chemistry patterns. "You sound impressed," Horus observed with grim humor. "I am. From a technical standpoint, these weapons represent remarkable engineering achievements. They solve complex problems of targeting superhuman physiology, while leaving baseline human populations unaffected." Ferrus's expression was neutral, analytical. "The Emperor and his collaborators have spent considerable time and resources developing the means to kill us efficiently." The weight of that clinical assessment settled over the chamber like cold metal. There was something particularly chilling about hearing their planned destruction described in terms of engineering efficiency by one of their own. "What are our options?" Guilliman asked, bringing his administrative mindset to bear on their situation. "If we accept these files as authentic, and I see no viable alternative, then we must develop strategic responses to the threats they represent." "Limited options," Dawn replied. "Direct confrontation triggers immediate activation of termination protocols. Flight is impossible given Imperial reach. Passive acceptance leads to certain death within 50 years. "Which leaves coordinated resistance," Vulcan said, his voice heavy with reluctant acceptance. "We must build sufficient military capability to make our termination strategically inadvisable." Ferrus Manus was manipulating another data display, pulling up force composition analysis and resource allocation charts. "The challenge is not military capability. Our combined legions represent significant force projection. The challenge is coordination without detection. Imperial monitoring systems are designed specifically to identify unusual communication patterns between Primarch commands. We need secure communication protocols, Sanguinius agreed. Methods of coordination that appear to be routine military coordination rather than conspiracy. I have been considering this problem, Guilliman said, calling up his own display showing the administrative structure of the Imperium. Joint training exercises are common between multiple legions. Resource-sharing agreements for specialized equipment and expertise. Combined operations against particularly challenging targets. The Gurak incident, Horus said suddenly, his strategic mind seizing on the implication. A theoretical Xenos threat in the galactic rim that requires coordinated response from multiple legions, not yet formally documented, but serious enough to warrant extensive planning and coordination. Joint training exercises to prepare for potential Gurak-class threats, Dawn continued, understanding immediately. Tactical analysis, resource sharing, communication protocols, all perfectly routine military planning. Vulcan was nodding slowly, his tactical acumen engaged despite his emotional distress. It provides cover for regular communication and coordination, military necessities that would not trigger monitoring protocols. And it gives us time to build defensive capabilities without appearing to prepare for internal conflict, Ferris added, his mechanical fingers already working through technical specifications. Research into countertoxin production, enhanced armor development, communication security improvements. Guilliman activated a new display showing potential Legion deployments across the galaxy. We must also consider which of our other brothers can be trusted with this knowledge. The files indicate that not all Primarchs will be terminated simultaneously. Some may be retained longer for specific strategic purposes. Or some may be offered the opportunity to participate in the termination of others, Horus said grimly. Divide and conquer strategies are fundamental to eliminating resistance. The chamber fell silent as each Primarch contemplated that possibility. The idea that some of their brothers might be turned against the rest was almost as horrifying as the planned termination itself. Leman Russ, Sanguinius said finally, his loyalty to the Emperor runs deeper than almost anyone's, if approached incorrectly. He becomes a threat rather than an ally, Dawn finished, as do others who might prioritize duty to the Emperor over self-preservation. The Lion is similarly problematic, Ferris observed. His sense of honor might compel him to report our activities rather than join them. Vulcan was studying the genetic analysis files with particular intensity, his expression growing darker with each line he read. These flaws they have identified in our genetics. They are not random mutations or environmental factors. They are deliberate design elements. Explain, Guilliman requested. My enhanced metabolism, my rapid healing capabilities, they are described here as acceptable resource consumption rates given projected operational lifespan. As if my biological needs were calculated based on an assumption that I would only need to function for a specific period. Vulcan's massive hands were trembling now, the emotional impact of the revelation breaking through his usual calm demeanor. They built me to burn brightly and briefly, then planned my death before I ever drew my first breath. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. Each of them had devoted their existence to serving the Emperor's vision, believing themselves to be trusted sons working toward a shared goal. Now they were confronting the reality that they had always been temporary tools, created with expiration dates as deliberate as their enhanced capabilities. We need to establish priority targets for recruitment, Horus said, bringing their focus back to practical considerations. Brothers we can trust, who have the strategic capability to contribute meaningfully to our resistance efforts. Magnus the Red, Sanguinius suggested. His psychic abilities could be crucial for secure communication and detecting surveillance. Also the most dangerous to approach, Dawn countered. His psychic abilities make him the most likely to be monitored by Imperial psychers. Corvus Corax, Vulcan offered. His expertise in stealth and infiltration could be invaluable. Khan, Ferrus added. His mobility and independence make him difficult for Imperial forces to monitor or control. Guilliman was taking notes, organizing their suggestions with characteristic efficiency. We should prioritize based on strategic value and recruitment risk. High-value targets with low probability of betrayal. And we need to move carefully, Horus emphasized. Every recruitment attempt creates risk of exposure. If our activities are detected before we have sufficient strength to resist, the termination protocols activate immediately. Dawn finished. Game over. As they continued planning, each Primarch felt the weight of irrevocable change settling over them like armor being locked into place. They had entered this meeting as individuals discovering a shared threat. They were leaving it as conspirators committed to resistance against their creator. The bonds of loyalty that had once tied them to the Emperor were being replaced by different bonds, those of shared danger, mutual dependence, and the cold calculation of warriors who had learned that their survival depended entirely on their own efforts. One final consideration, Ferrus said, as their planning drew toward conclusion. We must prepare for the possibility that we will not be able to save all our brothers. Some will refuse to believe the evidence. Some will choose loyalty to the Emperor over self-preservation. Some may be eliminated before we can reach them. The weight of that possibility settled into each of them like a physical blow. They were not just planning their own survival. They were potentially planning to watch their brothers die for their loyalty to the being who had planned to kill them all. Then we save who we can, Vulcan said quietly, his voice carrying the pain of someone accepting necessary loss. And we make sure their deaths serve the purpose of protecting those who remain. As they prepared to leave the derelict station, each Primarch understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. They were no longer the Emperor's loyal sons. They were survivors planning a war against their own father, with the future of their entire bloodlines hanging in the balance. The galaxy was about to become a very different place. Chapter 6. The Dividing Line. The asteroid mining facility hung in the void like a metallic spider, its industrial arms reaching into the cosmic darkness. It had been chosen for this meeting because it was remote, temporary, and scheduled for demolition once the mineral extraction was complete. A place where 8 Primarchs could gather without triggering the surveillance networks that monitored more official venues. Horus stood in the facility's central chamber, watching his brothers arrive one by one through the docking ports. The first 6 came as expected: Sanguinius, Dawn, Guilliman, Vulcan, and Ferrus Manus, their faces carrying the weight of shared knowledge and grim purpose. They had spent the past week refining their approach, preparing arguments and evidence for the 2 brothers they hoped to recruit tonight. Leman Russ arrived with the easy confidence that characterized all his movements, his wolf-like grin brightening the chamber's stark industrial atmosphere. Behind him came Lion L. Johnson, moving with the silent precision of a hunter, his green eyes taking in every detail of the facility and cataloguing potential threats and escape routes. "Brothers," Russ said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone anticipating a pleasant evening among family. When Horus called for this gathering, I hoped it meant we had found some new enemy to crush together. The Great Crusade grows too quiet for my taste. The lion said nothing, but his gaze moved from face to face, reading expressions with the analytical intensity that made him such an effective strategic commander. Something in what he saw there made his posture shift, almost imperceptibly, from relaxed attention to combat readiness. "There is indeed an enemy," Horus said carefully, "but not the kind you might expect." He activated the chamber's privacy screens and began the presentation they had so carefully prepared. The Thunder Warrior files came first, documented evidence of systematic elimination, medical records showing deliberate termination protocols, administrative orders signed by the highest levels of Imperial authority. Russ's expression shifted from interest to confusion to growing anger as the evidence mounted. "What is this?" he demanded. "Some kind of jest? You cannot seriously believe the All-Father would murder his own warriors." "Not murder," Dawn corrected quietly. "Strategic resource reallocation. Administrative efficiency. The documentation is quite clear about the justification." "The documentation is fabricated," Russ snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Someone has created these lies to sow discord among the legions." The Lion was studying the data slates with intense focus, his analytical mind working through the evidence with mathematical precision. Unlike Russ's emotional rejection, his skepticism was methodical, examining authentication codes and cross-referencing details against his own memories. "The biometric signatures are genuine," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant acceptance. "I recognize Malkador's authorization patterns, the Emperor's genetic markers in the command authorizations. These files are authentic." "Then the Lion has been deceived as well," Russ said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "The All-Father would never—" "Review the genetic analysis files," Sanguinius interrupted, handing Russ a second data slate. "The documentation of our engineered vulnerabilities." Russ's eyes moved across the screen, his expression growing darker with each line. When he reached the section detailing the Wolf Lord's own genetic markers, the calculated instability that made his warriors so fierce but also so short-lived, something fundamental shifted in his posture. "These are theoretical studies," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Contingency planning for hypothetical scenarios." "No," Vulcan said quietly. "They are operational protocols for actual biological weapons. We have seen the production facilities, Lehman. The weapons exist. They are ready for deployment." The Lion finished his review of the files and set them aside with deliberate precision. "The evidence is conclusive. The Emperor has planned our termination from the beginning of the Great Crusade. The only questions now are when and how. And what we do about it," Ferris added. Russ was quiet for a long moment, his warrior's instincts warring with his unshakable loyalty to the Emperor. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone whose fundamental beliefs had been shattered. "Even if this is true, and I am not saying it is, the All-Father's wisdom exceeds our understanding. If he has planned our transition, it is because he sees necessities that we cannot comprehend." The chamber fell silent. Every other Primarch stared at Russ with expressions ranging from disbelief to horror. "You would accept your own murder?" Gilliman asked, his voice carefully controlled. "You would walk willingly to your execution because the Emperor commands it?" "I would trust in the All-Father's judgment," Russ replied firmly, "as I have always done. As we all swore to do when we accepted his call to crusade." "And what of your sons?" Vulcan demanded, his usual gentleness replaced by smoldering fury. "The space wolves who have served loyally for 2 centuries? You would see them murdered alongside you for the convenience of Imperial administration." Something flickered across Russ's face at that. Pain, uncertainty, the recognition that his loyalty extended beyond himself to the warriors who called him father. But when he spoke, His voice remained steady. If that is what the All-Father requires for the good of humanity, then yes, we are weapons in his hand. Weapons do not question their wielder. The lion was watching this exchange with growing alarm. Your loyalty is admirable, Leman, but misplaced in this instance. The Emperor's plan represents a fundamental violation of the bonds of kinship and service that bind the Imperium together. If he can murder his own sons for convenience, what other betrayals might he justify for strategic necessity? The lion speaks wisdom, Dawn agreed. The precedent this sets undermines the entire foundation of imperial governance. If the Primarchs can be eliminated when their usefulness ends, what prevents similar treatment of planetary governors, sector commanders, or any other imperial servant who becomes inconvenient? Russ's jaw was set in stubborn lines. You speak of betrayal, but I see treachery in this very gathering. You have called me here not to warn me of danger, but to recruit me into conspiracy against the Emperor himself. The weight of accusation in his words settled over the chamber like armor being locked into place. This was the moment they had all feared, the division of the Brotherhood into those who would resist and those who would remain loyal unto death. It is not treachery to defend yourself against planned murder, Horus said carefully. It is treachery to plot against the Emperor, Russ countered. And that is what this is, regardless of how you justify it to yourselves. The lion had been listening to this exchange with increasing agitation. Now he stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Enough debate. The evidence is clear. The threat is real. Our response must be immediate and direct. His green eyes swept across the assembled Primarchs with predatory intensity. We confront the Emperor directly. We demand answers. We force him to justify his actions and defend his plans. That would trigger immediate activation of the termination protocols, Dawn replied. We would be dead before we could present our case. Then we die with honor instead of living as conspirators, the lion said coldly. I will not skulk in the shadows, gathering evidence and building secret alliances like some common rebel. If the Emperor intends our death, let him face us openly and explain why. And accomplish nothing except our own destruction, Guilliman objected. Strategic patience is required here, not heroic gestures. The lion's expression hardened. I have heard enough. You ask me to choose between loyalty and survival, honor and expediency. There is no choice to be made. He looked directly at Horus, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. I will give you 1 day to abandon this conspiracy and report your activities to the Emperor. After that, I will do so myself. The silence that followed was deafening. 8 Primarchs stood in the asteroid facility's central chamber, and the bonds of brotherhood that had united them for 2 centuries cracked like ice under sudden pressure. Russ nodded slowly, his decision made. The lion speaks truth. I will not be part of this treachery. His hand moved to his weapon, not in threat, but in promise. And I will not allow it to continue if I have the power to stop it. The other 6 Primarchs exchanged glances, heavy with unspoken communication. They had prepared for skepticism, for reluctance, for difficult persuasion. They had not prepared for outright rejection and active opposition from brothers they had hoped to save. Leman, Sanguinius said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of friendship. If you report our activities to the Emperor, you sentence us all to death. If I do not report them, I become complicit in treason against the master we all serve, the master who plans to murder you, the master whose wisdom I trust above my own survival. Vulcan stepped forward, his massive frame radiating controlled fury. Then you are a fool, brother, a loyal fool, but a fool nonetheless." Russ's hand tightened on his weapon. "And you are a traitor, however noble your intentions." The chamber crackled with tension as 8 superhuman warriors faced each other across an ideological chasm that could not be bridged. Every Primarch present understood that they had reached a point where words would not suffice, where the bonds of brotherhood would be tested by the cold logic of survival. Horus felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. The decision was his to make, and every option led to tragedy. They could not allow Russ and the Lion to report their activities. That would mean certain death for all of them. But stopping them would require violence against their own brothers, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. "Leman," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of the War Master, but tempered with genuine pain. "I cannot let you leave here with knowledge that will destroy us all." Russ's smile was sharp as a blade. "Then you had better be prepared to stop me, brother, because I will not be swayed from my duty by threats or force." The Lion's hand moved to his weapon as well, his tactical mind already calculating angles and positions. "Nor will I." And in that moment, as 8 Primarchs stood on the edge of fratricidal violence, the Great Crusade's unity died. What had begun as an investigation into troubling evidence had become an irreconcilable schism that would divide the Emperor's sons into opposing camps. The war for survival was about to become a war between brothers, and the galaxy would never be the same. Chapter 7. The Point of No Return. The Red Tear cut through the void with predatory grace, its sleek hull reflecting the cold light of distant stars. Aboard his flagship, Leman Russ stood before the primary communications array, his massive fingers dancing across the control interface with uncharacteristic precision. The message he was preparing would reach Terra within hours, carrying information that would shatter the fragile conspiracy his brothers had built. He had given them their day, as he had promised. 24 hours to abandon their treasonous plans and report their activities to the Emperor. They had chosen defiance instead, leaving him no alternative but to fulfill his duty as he saw it. The communication began recording, Russ's voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "All-Father, I must report activities among the Primarchs that constitute treason against the Imperial throne. Evidence of conspiracy has been presented to me by—" The transmission cut off abruptly as the Red Tear's defensive systems registered incoming contacts. 6 ships, emerging from the warp with the precision of a coordinated military operation. The Vengeful Spirit led the formation, flanked by vessels belonging to Sanguinius, Dawn, Gilliman, Vulcan, and Ferrus Manus. "My lord," his communications officer reported, "we are receiving transmission requests from multiple Primarch vessels. They are requesting immediate audience." Russ's smile was sharp as a blade. So his brothers had chosen to reveal their hand, rather than allow his message to reach Terra. The decision told him everything he needed to know about how far they had already fallen into rebellion. "Deny all communication requests," he commanded. "Prepare to transmit on Imperial emergency frequencies." But even as he spoke, the Red Tear's systems began experiencing cascading failures. Navigation, communications, defensive screens, all suffering simultaneous malfunctions that spoke of deliberate sabotage rather than random system collapse. "Ferrus," Russ muttered, recognizing the hand of the Iron Hand's Primarch in the precise technical assault on his ship's capabilities. His brother's mastery of technology was being turned against him, transforming the Red Tear from a warship into a trapped animal. The first boarding pods struck the hull with the sound of thunder, cutting through armor that had withstood the fury of countless Xenos weapons. Russ felt the ship shudder under the impact and knew that his brothers were coming for him. Not to persuade, not to negotiate, but to silence him by whatever means necessary. "All hands, repel boarders," he commanded, his voice carrying across the ship's internal communications. "Primarchs aboard. Lethal force authorized." The irony was not lost on him. He was ordering his sons to fire upon their uncles, to spill the blood of space marines in fratricidal combat aboard his own flagship. But duty demanded it, just as duty had demanded that he report their conspiracy. The first breach came in the main hangar bay. Horus led the assault personally, the War Master's presence radiating authority, even as he committed the ultimate act of rebellion. Behind him came Sanguinius, his golden armor spattered with the blood of space wolves who had tried to slow their advance, his beautiful face set in lines of terrible resolve. Russ met them in the ship's central corridor, his massive form filling the passage like a living wall. In his hands, Mjolnir crackled with barely contained energy, its power field casting dancing shadows on the bulkheads. "Brother," Horus said, his voice carrying genuine pain beneath the tactical necessity, "you force our hand." "I do my duty," Russ replied, his wolf-like grin returning despite the circumstances, "as you should be doing yours." "Our duty is to survive," Sanguinius said quietly. "Your loyalty to the Emperor is admirable, but it will see us all dead. Better dead with honor than alive with treachery." The battle began with the speed and violence that characterized all Primarch combat. Russ's opening charge was a thing of terrible beauty, his enhanced physiology pushing him forward with enough force to crack the corridor's deck plating. Mjolnir swept in a wide arc that would have bisected a normal opponent. But Horus was far from normal. The War Master's parry sent shock waves through both weapons, the clash of power fields creating a brief flare of light that momentarily blinded the watching Space Marines. Sanguinius moved to flank, his own blade seeking the gaps in Russ's armor with surgical precision. For several minutes, the three Primarchs fought in the confined space of the corridor, their superhuman speed turning the battle into a blur of motion almost too fast for normal eyes to follow. Russ was magnificent in his fury, his berserker instincts transforming him into a force of nature that carved through everything in his path. But he was outnumbered, and his brothers had not come unprepared. Dawn's arrival shifted the balance decisively. The Imperial Fist appeared at the corridor's far end, his storm shield forming an impenetrable barrier, while his Power Fist sought opportunities to strike. With 4 Primarchs arrayed against him, Russ's tactical situation became impossible. The end came when Vulcan entered the battle. The Salamander's Primarch had been holding back, his gentle nature rebelling against the necessity of violence against a brother. But when Russ's wild swings began threatening the structural integrity of the ship, and by extension, the lives of everyone aboard, his protective instincts overrode his reluctance. Vulcan's hammer strike caught Russ across the chest, the impact driving him to his knees despite his enhanced constitution. The Wolf Lord's snarl of defiance died as Sanguinius's blade found the neural interface at the base of his neck, sending carefully calibrated electrical pulses through his nervous system. Leman Russ, Primarch of the 6th Legion, collapsed unconscious to the deck of his own flagship. The silence that followed was deafening. 5 Primarchs stood in a corridor littered with the bodies of space wolves and the debris of their battle, staring down at their fallen brother with expressions that mixed triumph with profound loss. "Is he?" Vulcan began. "Unconscious," Sanguinius confirmed, his medical knowledge allowing him to assess Russ's condition with a glance. "The neural disruption will keep him sedated for several hours." "And then what?" Horus asked, the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. "We cannot hold him indefinitely. When he wakes, his loyalty to the Emperor will be unchanged." "We could try to convince him again," Guilliman suggested, though his tone carried little hope of success. "He has made his choice," Dawn said flatly, "multiple times. Further persuasion will not succeed." The implications hung in the air between them, like a blade waiting to fall. They had crossed the line from conspiracy to violence, from investigation to active rebellion. There could be no return from this moment, no restoration of the old bonds that had united them as sons of the Emperor. "We cannot kill him," Vulcan said firmly. "Whatever else we have become, we are not kinslayers." "Cannot? Or will not?" Ferrus Manus had arrived during the battle's final moments, his mechanical hands stained with the blood of space wolves who had tried to stop his technical sabotage. "Our survival may require choices we would prefer not to make." "There are limits to what survival justifies," Sanguinius said quietly. "Lines we cannot cross without losing the very thing we seek to preserve." Horus looked down at Russ's unconscious form, feeling the weight of decisions that would reshape the galaxy pressing down on him. They had hoped to save their brother, to bring him into the conspiracy and protect him from the Emperor's planned termination. Instead, they had been forced to make him their enemy, to commit violence against the bonds of brotherhood that had defined their existence. "We keep him alive," he decided finally. "Contained, sedated if necessary, but alive. Perhaps in time, when he sees the full extent of the Emperor's betrayal, he will understand why we chose this path." "And if he does not?" Dawn asked. "Then we will deal with that choice when it comes. For now, we have larger concerns." Horus looked around at his fellow conspirators, seeing in their faces the same grim recognition that filled his own thoughts. "We have openly defied Primarch loyalty. We have committed acts of war against the Emperor's chosen. There can be no hiding our activities now." "The lion," Guilliman said suddenly. "He gave us one day as well. If he has not already reported our conspiracy to Terra—" "He has," Dawn said with certainty. "By now, the Emperor knows of our activities. The termination protocols have likely been activated." The weight of that possibility settled over them like gravity from a dead star. "Signal our fleets," he commanded. "All legions under our command are to assume defensive positions. No Imperial vessel is to be trusted. No communication from Terra is to be accepted without verification from our inner circle." "We should attempt to contact our other brothers," Sanguinius suggested. "Magnus, Corvus, Khan. They need to be warned about what is coming." "If it is not already too late," Ferrus added grimly. "The Emperor's response to our rebellion will be swift and decisive. Those who cannot be recruited immediately may be eliminated before we can reach them." The thought of their brothers dying in ignorance, executed for loyalty to the being who had planned their deaths from the beginning, was almost more than any of them could bear. But it was the reality they now faced, a galaxy where the Emperor's sons would be hunted by their own father, where the bonds of kinship had been replaced by the cold calculation of survival. "We save who we can," Horus said finally. "We fight for what we must, and we make sure that when this war ends, humanity will remember that the Primarchs died not as traitors, but as sons betrayed by the father who should have protected them." As they worked to secure Russ and prepare for the battles to come, each Primarch understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The Great Crusade was over. The age of the Imperium was ending before it had truly begun. In its place, a new age was dawning, darker, more uncertain, but potentially more honest than what had come before. An age where the sons of the Emperor would fight not for his vision of unified humanity, but for their own right to exist in the galaxy they had helped him conquer. The war for survival had begun in earnest, and the galaxy would never be the same. Chapter 8. The Emperor's Response. The throne room of the Imperial Palace had witnessed many dark councils over the centuries, but none quite like this. The Emperor of mankind sat motionless upon the golden throne, his psychic presence filling the vast chamber with an oppressive weight that made the air itself seem thick and hostile. Before him knelt Lion Eljonson, the first Primarch's green armor, bearing the scars of rapid transit from the outer rim to Terra. "Rise!" the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of rule. "Report!" The Lion stood with fluid grace, his tactical mind already cataloguing the positions of the custodian guards that lined the chamber walls. "My brothers have discovered your termination protocols. They have formed a conspiracy to resist implementation of Phase 2 transition procedures." "Which brothers?" "Horus leads them. Sanguinius, Dawn, Guilliman, Vulcan, and Ferrus Manus have joined the conspiracy. They attempted to recruit both myself and Leman Russ. When we refused, they made clear their intent to eliminate any who might report their activities to you." The Emperor was silent for several minutes, his golden eyes focused on something beyond the physical boundaries of the throne room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no trace of surprise, anger, or betrayal. Only the cool assessment of a strategist adjusting his calculations. "Leman Russ? Captured during an attempt to warn you directly. His ship was boarded by the conspirators. His current status is unknown." "Anticipated," the Emperor said simply. The probability matrices indicated a 47% chance of premature discovery, with Horus as the most likely vector for initial exposure. Contingency protocols are in place. Malcador the Sigillite emerged from the shadows at the chamber's edge, his ancient face bearing the weight of sorrows yet to come. "My lord, if I may, the Lion's report confirms our tactical assessments. The rebellion has moved beyond theoretical resistance to active military operations." "Then we proceed to active countermeasures." The Emperor's attention turned to the tactical displays that surrounded his throne, showing real-time positions of every Primarch fleet across the galaxy. "Begin Phase 2 termination protocols immediately. Authorization, Imperator Rex 7. Malcador's hands moved across control interfaces with practiced efficiency, accessing systems that existed in the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace's infrastructure. Genetic activation sequences are online. Targeting parameters? All confirmed Rebels' first priority. Secondary targets include any Primarch whose loyalty remains uncertain. The Emperor's golden gaze fixed on the Lion. "You will provide detailed intelligence on their strategic capabilities, fleet positions, and likely responses to various tactical stimuli." "Of course, my lord." The Lion inclined his head, though something in his expression suggested the weight of what he had just enabled. "However, I must note that their discovery of the protocols has likely prompted defensive measures. They may have developed countermeasures to the biological agents." "Irrelevant. The genetic activation sequences are hardwired into their cellular structure. Countermeasures may delay effectiveness, but cannot prevent it entirely." The Emperor rose from his throne, his massive form casting shadows across the chamber that seemed to move with predatory intent. "How long since your departure from their gathering?" 18 hours, my lord." "Then they have had sufficient time to begin their preparations. Malcador, deploy custodian elimination teams to the following targets: Magnus the Red, Corvus Corax, Jagatai Khan. Execute termination protocols before they can be recruited by the rebels." The Sigillite's stylus paused over his data slate. "My lord, these Primarchs have shown no indication of disloyalty." They represent strategic assets that cannot be permitted to fall into rebel hands. Their elimination is a tactical necessity, not a judgment of their character. The Emperor's voice carried the finality of an executioner's axe. "Execute the orders." "At once, my lord." Malcador's fingers moved across the interface, dispatching signals that would reach the galaxy's most elite killers within hours. Custodian Guard squadrons are being activated for immediate deployment. The Lion watched this exchange with growing unease. He had expected swift action against the proven rebels, but the casual ordering of execution for Primarchs, whose only crime was existing in an inconvenient strategic position, was more than even his pragmatic nature could easily accept. "What of their legions?" he asked. "The Space Marines remain loyal to their gene fathers. Eliminating the Primarchs will not automatically secure their forces." The Astartes were created with command override protocols embedded in their neurological architecture, the Emperor replied, calling up detailed schematics of Space Marine brain structure. With their Primarchs eliminated, these protocols can be activated to ensure compliance with new command structures. The Lion stared at the displayed neural maps with horrified fascination. "You can simply reprogram them. They were designed to be reprogrammable from the beginning. Every enhancement to their minds included pathways for external control. The appearance of free will was a necessity for operational effectiveness, not an actual limitation on their loyalty parameters." Malcador was accessing another set of files, these ones labeled with the names of chapter masters and legion commanders from across the galaxy. Activation of override protocols will require proximity to specialized transmission equipment. The process will take several months to complete across all affected legions. "Begin immediately. Priority deployment to legions commanded by confirmed rebels." The Emperor returned to his throne, his attention already shifting to the larger strategic picture. "What is our timeline for Webway project completion?" 47 years under optimal conditions, Malcador responded. "Accelerated timeline could reduce this to 32 years if we eliminate non-essential research phases. Implement acceleration protocols. The earlier-than-anticipated rebellion necessitates moving to the final phase of Imperial transition ahead of schedule." The Emperor's psychic presence expanded, filling the chamber with the weight of absolute authority. "Humanity's future cannot be delayed by the resistance of obsolete assets." The clinical language sent a chill through the Lion's enhanced physiology. His brothers, beings he had known for centuries, fought beside, shared victories and sorrows with, had been reduced to obsolete assets, requiring elimination for the convenience of Imperial logistics. "My lord," he said carefully, "perhaps some accommodation could be reached. If the rebellious Primarchs could be made to understand the necessity of the transition. Understanding is irrelevant. Compliance is what matters." The Emperor's golden eyes fixed on the Lion with predatory intensity. "Your sentiment does you credit, but strategic necessity supersedes emotional attachments. The rebels have chosen resistance. The consequences of that choice are not negotiable." Malcador looked up from his data slate, his expression grave. "First wave deployment is confirmed. Custodian teams are en route to Magnus on Prospero, Corax on Deliverance, and Khan on Chogoris. Estimated time to target, 72 hours. And the genetic activation sequences. Transmitted to specialized broadcast stations across the galaxy. Initial activation will begin within 6 hours, affecting Primarchs within range of transmission nodes." The Sigillite paused, consulting additional displays. "We should note that the rebels' discovery of our plans may have prompted them to remove themselves from areas with transmission coverage." "Expected. Which is why the custodian teams are a parallel approach. If the biological agents prove insufficient, Direct action will compensate. The Emperor stood again, moving to examine a three-dimensional display of the galaxy that showed Primarch positions, Imperial fleet deployments, and strategic resource nodes. What are our projections for Rebel fleet strength? The Lion consulted his own tactical memories of the conspiracy's revelations. 6 confirmed Primarchs, with their associated Legion fleets, combined strength approximately 800,000 Astartes across multiple battle groups, significant naval assets, including flagship-class vessels and specialized support craft. Manageable. Imperial Navy assets outnumber Rebel forces by approximately 40-1. The challenge will be preventing the rebellion from spreading to Imperial Army commanders and planetary governors who may sympathize with Primarch resistance. Purge protocols are prepared for immediate implementation, Malcador confirmed. Administrative elimination of potentially disloyal personnel can begin within days. The scope of what was being planned settled over the Lion like a weight of cold iron. Not just the elimination of his rebellious brothers, but systematic purges of anyone who might sympathize with their cause. Entire sectors of Imperial leadership would be liquidated to prevent the spread of resistance. How extensive? He asked. Complete, the Emperor replied without hesitation. Any individual with significant contact with Rebel Primarchs, any commander who might question the transition to purely human governance, any administrator whose loyalty remains uncertain. The transition to Phase 2 requires absolute certainty of compliance. The numbers began adding up in the Lion's tactical mind. Millions of Imperial servants, tens of millions of military personnel, potentially hundreds of millions of citizens across worlds that had been ruled directly by the Primarchs, all marked for elimination to ensure the smooth implementation of the Emperor's new order. The scope seems extensive. Necessitated by the rebellion's premature activation, the Emperor said, his tone suggesting the topic was closed to further discussion. Had the transition proceeded according to original timelines, far fewer eliminations would have been required. The rebels' resistance has forced acceleration of protocols that were designed to be implemented gradually. Malcador was reviewing additional reports flowing in from across the galaxy. Initial intelligence suggests the rebels are attempting to contact additional Primarchs. We should assume they will try to recruit Magnus, Corvus, and Khan before our teams arrive. Then the teams must arrive first. Authorization for immediate warp translation, regardless of Geller field stability concerns. Speed is more important than crew survival rates for this operation. The casual dismissal of the custodian guards' lives, warriors who had served the Emperor with absolute loyalty for millennia, illustrated the depth of transformation in Imperial priorities. Nothing mattered now except the successful elimination of threats to the transition plan. It will be done, Malcador confirmed. Estimated arrival time reduced to 48 hours. Acceptable casualty rates among transport crews projected at 60%. Acceptable. The Emperor returned to his throne, his attention already shifting to the vast psychic calculations required for his work on the Webway project. Monitor all developments. Report immediately if rebel activities exceed predicted parameters. As the Lion prepared to leave the throne room, he understood that he had witnessed the emergence of something far more terrifying than the rebellion his brothers had started. The Emperor had revealed himself not as a betrayed father, responding to ungrateful sons, but as a cold strategist, eliminating inconvenient assets with the same emotional investment he might show in discarding broken tools. The rebellion had been an attempt to prevent their planned termination. Instead, it had triggered the immediate implementation of protocols that would reshape the galaxy through systematic violence on an unprecedented scale. Walking through the corridors of the Imperial Palace, the lion realized that his brother's greatest mistake had not been discovering the Emperor's plans. It had been believing that those plans could be negotiated with, reasoned with, or resisted through conventional means. The Emperor was not their father. He never had been. He was their creator, their employer, their strategic superior. And when tools outlived their usefulness, tools were discarded, regardless of how effectively they protested their own destruction. The war that was coming would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Not a rebellion against tyranny, but a conflict between creations and their creator, over the fundamental question of who had the right to determine who deserved to exist. And the creator had just demonstrated exactly how far he was willing to go to defend that right. Chapter 9. The Price of Defiance. The medical bay of the Fist of Iron had been transformed into something that resembled both a surgical suite and a battlefield command center. Cables snaked across the floor connecting biomonitoring equipment to gene sequencing arrays, while tactical displays showed real-time updates from across the rebel fleet. In the center of this technological maze, Vulcan lay on an examination table, his massive frame racked with tremors that no amount of enhanced physiology could control. Ferrus Manus stood over his brother, his mechanical hands moving with inhuman precision as he worked to understand what was happening to Vulcan's cellular structure. The bioscanners painted a picture of systematic breakdown, cells dying in carefully orchestrated patterns, organs beginning to fail in sequences that spoke of deliberate programming rather than natural disease. "The degradation is accelerating," Ferrus reported, his voice carrying the clinical precision he reserved for his most complex technical challenges. "Cellular regeneration has dropped to 15% of normal levels. Organ function is declining across multiple systems simultaneously." Vulcan's eyes opened with effort, their usual warm glow dimmed by pain and the growing weakness that was consuming him from within. "How long?" "At current rates, 72 hours before complete system failure." Ferrus consulted another display showing genetic marker analysis. "The kill switch is targeting specific protein chains in your enhanced metabolism. It is using your own genetic advantages against you. The faster healing, the enhanced strength, all of it becomes a vector for accelerated breakdown." Across the chamber, Sanguinius stood before a tactical hologram, his golden armor reflecting the blue light of the displays, but his attention was not focused on the strategic information before him. His eyes were distant, unfocused, seeing visions that existed beyond the physical realm. "They are coming," he said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of prophetic certainty. "Magnus first, 3 days, then Corvus, 5 days after that. Khan will escape the initial assault, but—" He paused, his enhanced perception passing the temporal streams that flowed around them. "Khan will face a choice between flight and loyalty to his legion. He will choose loyalty." Horus looked up from the communication console where he had been coordinating with their scattered forces. "What do you see of our other brothers?" "Alpharius and Omegon remain hidden, as is their nature. They may survive simply because the Emperor cannot locate them to eliminate them." Sanguinius's expression darkened. "Mortarion is difficult to read. His legion's resistance to biological agents may protect him from the genetic kill switches, but he will face other threats." "And the others?" "Gone." The word fell into the chamber like a stone into still water, creating ripples of horror that touched every face present. "Perturabo, Angron, Lorgar. The Emperor's agents reach them before our warnings do." Dawn moved to another console, accessing real-time reports from across the galaxy. "Confirmed. We have lost contact with Perturabo's fleet as of 6 hours ago. Angron's position on Bot was overrun by custodian forces 3 hours past. No word from Lorgar since his departure for Colchis. The weight of loss settled over the chamber like gravity from a dead star. Brothers they had known for centuries, warriors they had fought alongside and trusted with their lives, simply gone, eliminated with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. Guilliman entered the medical bay, his normally immaculate armor bearing the scars of recent combat. "We have secured Magnus," he reported. "Barely. The custodian assassination team reached Prospero 18 hours ahead of our warning. By the time our forces arrived, Magnus was fighting for his life in the ruins of his own library." "His condition?" Ferrus asked. "Alive, but changed. The psychic assault triggered something in his genetic structure, not the kill switch, but a defensive response that has enhanced certain aspects of his abilities while destroying others." Guilliman activated a medical display showing brain scan data. "His psychic power has increased exponentially, but his physical form is becoming unstable. He may not survive the transition." Vulcan struggled to sit up, his enhanced musculature failing to support even his own weight. "Save who you can. Do not waste resources on the dying." "You are not dying," Ferrus said firmly, returning his attention to the genetic analysis displays. "I will find a solution. The kill switch is sophisticated, but it follows predictable patterns. Every system can be circumvented if you understand its operational parameters." "And if you cannot?" Ferrus was quiet for a moment, his mechanical fingers pausing in their manipulation of the data streams. "Then I will ensure your death serves the purpose of protecting our remaining brothers." The clinical statement sent a chill through the chamber, but no one challenged it. They had all crossed too many lines in the past few days to maintain comfortable illusions about the choices they might be forced to make. Sanguinius's attention snapped back to the present, his prophetic vision delivering new information. "Corvus is moving. He received our warning in time and is extracting from Deliverance, but the custodian team is in pursuit. He needs immediate support." "How much time?" Horus asked. 36 hours before they corner him in the core of our system. After that," Sanguinius shook his head. "The visions become unclear. Too many variables, too many possible outcomes." Dawn was already calculating force deployments and travel times. "We can reach the key of our system in 40 hours if we push the engines beyond safety parameters. But that assumes the custodian team does not have reinforcements waiting in the area." "They will," Guilliman said grimly. "The Emperor's response is systematic, coordinated. Every elimination mission will have multiple layers of support." "Then we go anyway." Horus felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, but it was different now, heavier, more personal. "We save who we can, even if it costs us everything." Ferrus looked up from his work on Vulcan's genetic structure. "I may have found something. The kill switch operates by disrupting specific protein synthesis pathways. If I can introduce synthetic alternatives, essentially replace the compromised biological functions with mechanical ones, it might slow or halt the degradation." "Might?" Vulcan asked. "The process would be extensive. Significant portions of your circulatory, respiratory, and nervous systems would need to be replaced with cybernetic alternatives." Ferrus's expression was grave. "You would survive, but you would not be unchanged." Vulcan was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. To live, he would need to sacrifice much of what made him who he was: the warmth, the enhanced healing, the genetic gifts that connected him to his legion and his homeworld. "Do it," he said finally. "Whatever it takes." As Ferrus began preparing the complex surgical procedures required, Sanguinius suddenly convulsed, his prophetic vision delivering information that struck him like a physical blow. "The Emperor has accelerated the timeline," he gasped. "Phase 2 is no longer a 50-year projection. He is attempting to complete the Webway project within 5 years, regardless of the cost in human resources." "What does that mean for us?" Dawn asked. "It means we are not just fighting for our own survival. We are fighting to prevent the wholesale restructuring of human civilization. He intends to eliminate not just the Primarchs, but every aspect of the Imperium that might resist the transition to purely human governance." Sanguinius's eyes blazed with prophetic fire. Planetary governors who showed loyalty to Primarch rule, Space Marine chapters that might resist new command structures, entire populations that have grown too attached to transhuman leadership. The scope of the planned purge was staggering. Not millions, but billions of lives marked for elimination to ensure the smooth implementation of the Emperor's vision. "We need to move faster," Horus decided. "Whatever operations we can mount to save our brothers, we do immediately. Every day we delay, the Emperor's preparations grow stronger." "Agreed," Guilliman said. "But we must also begin planning for the possibility that we cannot save them all. If we lose Magnus, Corvus, Khan, and the others, we need contingencies for continuing resistance with reduced numbers." The weight of those calculations, determining which of their brothers might be sacrificed for the greater goal of preserving some remnant of their rebellion, was almost unbearable. But it was the reality they now faced. As the medical procedures began on Vulcan, as tactical plans took shape for rescuing Corvus Corax, as reports continued to arrive of Primarchs lost and positions compromised, each surviving brother understood that they had entered a phase of the conflict where survival would be measured not in victory, but in how many of them would live to see whatever future emerged from the ashes of the Great Crusade. The rebellion had cost them their relationship with their Creator. Now it was costing them their brothers, their legions, and potentially their own lives. But still they fought, because the alternative, accepting the Emperor's judgment and walking willingly to their execution, was a betrayal of everything they had built together. In the medical bay of the Fist of Iron, as Vulcan underwent the first stages of extensive cybernetic replacement and Sanguinius passed visions of an uncertain future, the surviving Primarchs prepared for the next phase of their war against their own father. A war they were not certain they could win, but which they could not afford to lose. The price of defiance was higher than any of them had imagined, but the price of submission would be the end of everything they had fought to protect, and that was a cost none of them was willing to pay. Chapter 10. New Alliances. The shadow of the Emperor drifted in the void between realities, its hull scarred by recent battles with custodian assassination fleets. Inside its command chamber, 5 Primarchs gathered around a tactical display that showed the grim truth of their situation. Imperial forces outnumbered them 40-1. Their brother Primarchs were being systematically eliminated, and their window for meaningful resistance was closing with each passing day. Magnus the Red stood apart from the others, his form flickering between physicality and something else. Something that existed partially in the immaterium. The psychic assault on Prospero had changed him in ways that even his mastery of the warp could not fully comprehend. His remaining eye blazed with unnatural fire as he studied patterns of force and causality that only he could perceive. "There is another option," he said suddenly, his voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's air vibrate with supernatural resonance. Powers that oppose the Emperor. Forces that would welcome an alliance against their ancient enemy. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Every Primarch present knew what Magnus was suggesting, and the weight of that knowledge settled over them like cold armor. "Absolutely not," Sanguinius said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "We do not treat with the ruinous powers. That path leads to damnation for ourselves and everyone who follows us." "Does it?" Magnus's transformed features shifted, reality bending around him as his enhanced psychic abilities probed the currents of possibility. "Or does it lead to survival? To victory? To the preservation of our legions, and our vision of what humanity could become?" Horus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The desperation in Magnus's voice was unmistakable, but beneath it lay something else, a hunger that had not been there before his transformation. "Magnus, what have you seen?" "I have seen the Emperor's true nature revealed in all its terrible glory. I have witnessed the bargain he made eons ago to gain the power needed to create us." Magnus's form solidified as he focused his attention on his brothers. He struck a deal with the very powers he now claims to oppose. He took their gifts, used their knowledge, and then betrayed them when their usefulness ended. "Just as he plans to do with us," Ferrus Manus observed, his mechanical hands clenching into fists. The surgery to save Vulcan had been successful, but at a cost. Half his brother's organic systems had been replaced with cybernetic alternatives. The warm, compassionate Primarch they had known was becoming something colder, more machine than man. "Exactly. The Emperor is not our father. He is a thief who stole power from entities older and more terrible than himself, used that power to create us as tools for his ambition, and now seeks to discard us when we have served our purpose." Magnus moved to the tactical display, his presence causing the holographic projections to flicker and distort. But the original sources of that power remain. They remember the Emperor's betrayal, and they would be amenable to supporting those who oppose him. Dawn's tactical mind was already analyzing the implications. What would they want in return? Service, acknowledgement, the opportunity to reclaim what was taken from them. Magnus's smile was sharp as a blade. They do not seek to destroy humanity, merely to guide it along different paths than the Emperor envisions. "You mean enslave it," Sanguinius said flatly. "The Chaos Gods offer power, but the price is always higher than advertised. Is it worse than extinction?" The question came from an unexpected source, Corvus Corax, who had been silent since his rescue from the Custodian assassination team. The Raven Lord's pale features were drawn with exhaustion, and something deeper, a cynicism born of watching his homeworld burn while Imperial forces hunted his sons through the shadows. "We are dying, brothers. Our legions are being systematically eliminated. Our remaining brothers are being murdered by the being who created us." Corvus's dark eyes fixed on each of them in turn. "If there are powers willing to help us survive this purge, can we afford to reject them based on moral principles that may not survive the next month?" Vulcan attempted to speak, but his voice emerged as a mechanical rasp from the Vox grill that had replaced his damaged throat. "Some prices too high. Better death than damnation." "Easy words from someone whose legion is still intact," Corvus replied bitterly. "My sons are being hunted through the darkness of deliverance by custodian kill teams equipped with weapons designed specifically to counter our stealth capabilities. How many of them must die before survival becomes more important than purity?" The chamber crackled with tension as 5 Primarchs faced the fundamental question that would define not just their rebellion, but their very souls. In the growing silence, Magnus began to speak again, his voice carrying subtle harmonics that seemed to resonate directly with the listeners' minds. I have made contact with representatives of the powers beyond the veil. They offer alliance, not dominion. Military support against the Emperor's forces. Knowledge to counter his genetic weapons. Protection for our remaining legions. His transformed features shifted, becoming almost hypnotically compelling. All they ask in return is acknowledgement, recognition of their legitimate grievance against the Emperor who stole from them and then cast them aside. What manner of acknowledgement? Horus asked, though some part of his strategic mind already suspected the answer. Worship, devotion, the establishment of practices that honor their contributions to human development. Magnus's eye blazed with increasing intensity. Small prices for the power to protect our brothers and our sons. Sanguinius was backing away from Magnus, his enhanced senses detecting something fundamentally wrong in the psychic emanations surrounding his brother. Magnus, you are already falling to their influence. Can you not hear what you are saying? I hear the voice of pragmatism over the whisper of naive idealism, Magnus replied, his form beginning to flicker again as warp energies gathered around him. I see the future that awaits us if we cling to our father's moral restrictions while he murders us one by one. And I see corruption wearing the mask of necessity, Sanguinius shot back. This is exactly what the Emperor warned us about, the seductive nature of powers that offer easy solutions to impossible problems. The Emperor, Magnus laughed, the sound carrying overtones that made reality shiver. Who lied to us from the moment of our creation, who planned our deaths before we drew our first breaths, who even now deploys every weapon at his disposal to ensure our destruction. This is the being whose moral guidance you would follow. The question hung in the chamber like a toxic cloud. Each Primarch felt the weight of it, the terrible logic that underpinned Magnus's corruption. How could they maintain loyalty to the Emperor's principles while fighting for their lives against the Emperor himself? Corvus moved closer to Magnus, his expression thoughtful. What guarantees do they offer? How do we know they will not simply use us as tools, just as the Emperor has done? Because they gain nothing from our destruction, Magnus replied, his voice taking on an almost evangelical fervor. Our survival serves their interests. Our strength becomes their strength. Our success in overthrowing the Emperor advances their own goals. The alignment of interests is perfect. Until it isn't, Dawn said flatly. Powers that old and cunning do not form alliances. They collect assets. We would simply be trading one master for 4 others. 4 others who offer partnership rather than planned obsolescence, Magnus countered. 4 others who would see us as valuable allies rather than inconvenient tools. Ferrus Manus had been studying the tactical displays, his enhanced analytical capabilities processing the strategic implications of Magnus's proposal. The immediate military value is significant. Chaos-influenced forces could provide the numerical advantage we need to survive the Emperor's initial purge. You cannot be considering this, Sanguinius said, turning to face the Iron Hands Primarch with something approaching horror. I am considering all options that do not end with the complete extinction of our bloodlines, Ferrus replied coldly. If that includes temporary alliances with distasteful partners, then we evaluate the costs and benefits like any other strategic decision. This is not a strategic decision, it is a moral one, Vulcan managed to rasp through his mechanical voice box. Some victories, not worth winning. Tell that to the families of our fallen brothers, Corvus said, his voice carrying the weight of profound loss. Tell that to the Space Marines dying in service to Primarchs who chose principle over survival. As the argument continued, none of them noticed the subtle changes occurring in the chamber itself. The shadows had begun to move independently of their sources. The tactical displays flickered with images that had nothing to do with fleet positions or strategic assessments, and in the growing darkness at the chamber's edges, shapes began to coalesce, forms that existed somewhere between reality and nightmare, watching the Primarchs debate their futures with expressions of infinite patience and growing hunger. "The offer stands," Magnus said finally, his transformed features now bearing little resemblance to the scholar-warrior they had once known. "Alliance with powers that can guarantee our survival, or continued resistance with resources that dwindle daily while our enemies grow stronger." "How long do we have to decide?" Horus asked, feeling the weight of command pressing down on him like gravity from a dying star. "Time is a flexible concept when dealing with entities that exist partially outside normal causality," Magnus replied. "But the Emperor's forces will not wait for our philosophical debates to conclude. Each day we delay is another day for him to strengthen his position and eliminate more of our brothers." The tactical truth of that statement was undeniable. Even as they debated, Imperial forces were moving against targets across the galaxy. Every hour that passed was another hour closer to complete defeat. "I need time to consider this," Horus said finally. "All of us do. The implications are simple," Corvus interrupted. "We can die pure, or we can live compromised, but we cannot do both." As the gathering broke up, each Primarch wrestling with decisions that would define not just their own fates, but the future of human civilization itself. The shadows in the chamber's corners grew deeper and more active. The seeds of corruption had been planted, watered by desperation, and fertilized by the terrible logic of survival at any cost. The rebellion that had begun as an attempt to preserve their lives and their brotherhood was fracturing along the fault lines of moral compromise. Some would choose to maintain their principles regardless of the cost. Others would embrace whatever power offered salvation, regardless of the price. And in the spaces between choices, in the moments of doubt and desperation that afflicted even transhuman demigods, the ruinous powers waited with infinite patience for their inevitable harvest. The war for survival was becoming something far more dangerous, a war for the very souls of the Emperor's sons. And the outcome would reshape not just the Imperium, but the fundamental nature of humanity's relationship with forces beyond the material realm. The price of defiance had grown higher than any of them had imagined, but the alternative, accepting defeat and death at the hands of their creator, remained unthinkable, even if survival required them to become the very monsters their father had claimed to protect humanity from. Chapter 11. The Final Gambit. The solar system burned with the fire of civil war. 3 fleets converged on Terra from different vectors, their combined strength representing the last desperate gambit of the surviving loyal Primarchs. The vengeful spirit led the central assault, flanked by the Red Tear and the Fist of Iron. From the galactic south came Sanguinius aboard the Angel's Wrath, his golden fleet moving with the precision of a surgical strike. And from the rim, Dawn's Imperial Fist emerged from warp translation with the calculated fury of a fortress-breaking siege. They had left Magnus behind. The decision had torn at each of them, but his corruption had progressed beyond the point where he could be trusted in the presence of the Emperor. Corvus Corax had chosen his own path, disappearing into the shadows with those of his legion who remained alive, pursuing guerrilla warfare rather than direct confrontation. Ferrus Manus commanded a skeleton crew, most of his forces having been diverted to protecting refugee populations from imperial purges. This was not the grand alliance they had hoped to build. This was the remnant of a broken rebellion, making a final desperate strike at the heart of an empire that had turned against its own creators. Horus stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the tactical displays that showed Imperial defense fleets moving to intercept them. The numbers were overwhelming. For every ship in the rebel fleet, the Emperor had 10. For every space marine still loyal to their gene fathers, there were 100 Imperial Army soldiers ready to die for the Golden Throne. "Defense grid is activating," reported his tactical officer. "Lunar-class battle stations are coming online. We're reading massive energy signatures from the orbital defense platforms." "Expected," Horus replied, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him War Master. "Begin the approach as planned. Signal the Angel and the Stone. All ships are to maintain formation until we reach the inner system." The battle for Terra began with the cold mathematics of void warfare. Lance batteries reached across the darkness, trading fire at ranges where even enhanced human senses could not distinguish individual ships from background stars. The rebel fleet moved with desperate precision, using every tactical advantage their centuries of experience could provide. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting an enemy that knew they were coming. The first breakthrough came when Sanguinius's fleet engaged the lunar defense grid. The Angel led from the front, his personal assault craft carving through Imperial defensive formations with the fury of righteous vengeance. Behind him, the Blood Angels fought with a savagery that spoke of final desperation. They knew this was their last battle, and they intended to make it count. "The Angel has broken through the outer grid," Dawn reported over the fleet communications network. "Imperial fist forces are engaging the secondary defense line. Resistance is significant." Horus could hear the strain in his brother's voice. Dawn had designed many of the defenses they were now fighting through, and every breach was paid for with the blood of warriors he had trained himself. The psychological weight of attacking his own creations was taking its toll. "Press the attack," Horus commanded. "We have one chance to reach the palace before the Emperor activates whatever additional defenses he has prepared." The vengeful spirit shuddered as enemy fire found its shields, but the flagship pressed forward with inexorable determination. Around it, the remnants of the Sons of Horus fought with the desperate fury of warriors who had already lost everything that mattered to them. Their Primarch had been marked for death by the being who created him. Their legion was being systematically eliminated by Imperial forces. They had nothing left to lose except their lives, and those they would sell as dearly as possible. The breakthrough to Terra came at a cost that would have been unthinkable in any previous campaign. 3 rebel fleets became one battered formation as they penetrated the planet's atmosphere, their hulls scarred by defensive fire and their crews reduced to skeleton levels. But they had reached their target, and nothing in the galaxy could stop them now from reaching the Imperial Palace. The assault on the palace itself was a thing of terrible beauty. Space Marines who had once sworn oaths of loyalty to the Golden Throne now fought their way through corridors they had helped build, past defenses they had helped design, toward a confrontation with the master they had served for 2 centuries. Horus led the central assault, cutting through custodian guards and Imperial army units with the fury of a demigod betrayed. Behind him came the survivors of his inner circle, Sanguinius with his golden armor stained with the blood of their enemies, Dawn with his face set in lines of grim determination, Vulcan moving with mechanical precision through the destruction. The throne room doors stood open when they finally reached them, as if the Emperor had been expecting their arrival. The vast chamber was empty except for the massive figure seated upon the golden throne, his psychic presence filling the space with an oppressive weight that made the air itself seem hostile. "My sons," the Emperor said, his voice carrying across the chamber with the authority of 10,000 years of rule. "You have come far to meet your deaths." "We have come to demand answers," Horus replied, his voice echoing in the vast space. To understand why you planned our murders from the moment of our creation. The Emperor rose from his throne, his massive form seeming to grow larger as he moved. Planned? You misunderstand the nature of your existence. I created you to serve a specific function. When that function is complete, your continuation becomes counterproductive to human development. We are your sons, Sanguinius said, his voice carrying the weight of profound betrayal. We have served loyally for 2 centuries. We deserve better than disposal when our usefulness ends. You are weapons, the Emperor corrected, his golden eyes fixed on each of them with predatory intensity. Sophisticated weapons, certainly. Weapons with personalities and the illusion of independence, but weapons nonetheless. And when weapons outlive their purpose, they become dangers to those they were meant to protect. Dawn stepped forward, his tactical mind engaged despite the emotional devastation of the moment. You could have told us, given us the choice to step aside willingly when our service was complete. Could I? Would you have accepted termination gracefully? Would any of you have willingly submitted to execution for the greater good of humanity? The Emperor's laugh was devoid of warmth or humor. You are proving my point with your very presence here. Faced with obsolescence, you choose rebellion rather than acceptance. Because you gave us the capacity to choose, Vulcan rasped through his mechanical voice box. If we are only weapons, why grant us free will? Free will was an operational necessity. Tools that cannot think, cannot adapt to changing circumstances. But the appearance of independence was always just that, an appearance. The Emperor raised his hand, and the chamber filled with a golden light that seemed to emanate from his very being. You were designed with limitations, overrides, methods of control that ensured your loyalty regardless of your personal desires. The genetic kill switches, Horus said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. The psychological conditioning, the loyalty programming built into our very souls. All safeguards against the possibility that you might develop beyond your intended parameters. All methods of ensuring that when your usefulness ended, your elimination would be swift and certain. The Emperor's expression was one of mild disappointment, like a craftsman examining flawed tools. Your rebellion was anticipated. Your resistance was planned for. Even your arrival here serves my purposes. Sanguinius felt his enhanced senses detecting movement in the chamber's shadows. What purposes? The final demonstration of why transhuman leadership must end. When the historical records are written, this moment will be remembered as the day the Emperor's own creations turned against him, proving the necessity of purely human governance. The Emperor gestured toward the hidden observation galleries that lined the throne room. Representatives from across the galaxy watch this confrontation. They will bear witness to the dangers of allowing superhuman beings to wield power over baseline humanity. The trap was perfect in its simplicity. By coming here, by forcing this confrontation, they had provided the Emperor with exactly the justification he needed for Phase 2 of his transition plan. Their rebellion would be remembered not as resistance to planned murder, but as proof that Primarchs could not be trusted with authority over human affairs. You orchestrated everything, Dawn realized. The discovery of the files, Malcador's convenient departure, even our recruitment of each other. All of it was designed to create this moment. Not orchestrated, anticipated. There is a difference, though the practical result is the same. The Emperor began to descend from his throne, each step echoing through the chamber with the weight of absolute authority. Your psychological profiles indicated a 93% probability that discovery of the termination protocols would lead to rebellion rather than acceptance. I simply prepared for the most likely outcome. And our brothers? Horus asked. Magnus? Corvus? The ones who fell to chaos corruption? Necessary sacrifices. The corruption of some Primarchs provides additional justification for the elimination of all Primarchs. Humanity will see that even the most loyal sons can fall to temptation when granted too much power. The Emperor's golden eyes blazed with inhuman intensity. Your corruption becomes part of the historical record that justifies their permanent removal from positions of authority. The scope of the deception was staggering, not just their planned termination, but the careful orchestration of their rebellion to serve the Emperor's larger political goals. They had not just been marked for death, they had been maneuvered into providing the justification for their own elimination. "You are a monster," Vulcan said, his mechanical voice carrying the weight of absolute condemnation. "I am pragmatic. I am willing to make necessary choices for the survival and advancement of the human species. You are emotional attachments that have outlived their strategic value." The Emperor raised his hands, and power began to gather around him like a storm made of golden light. It is time to complete the demonstration. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the throne room of the Imperial Palace. 4 Primarchs, genetically engineered to be the ultimate warriors, fought against their creator with the desperate fury of beings who had nothing left to lose. Horus led the assault, his charismatic presence coordinating their attacks with tactical precision. Sanguinius struck from above, his wings carrying him through the air with impossible grace. Dawn anchored their formation, his defensive capabilities protecting them from the Emperor's psychic attacks. Vulcan advanced steadily through the destruction, his mechanical components immune to many of the powers that would have crippled his organic form. But they were fighting a being who had planned for this moment, who had designed their very genetic structure, who knew their capabilities and limitations better than they knew themselves. The Emperor's power was terrible to behold. Psychic energy that could reshape reality, physical strength that exceeded even Primarch capabilities, and tactical knowledge accumulated over millennia of warfare. Each attack they launched was turned aside or absorbed. Each strategy they employed was countered before it could be fully implemented. One by one, the Primarchs fell. Vulcan was the first, his mechanical systems overwhelmed by electromagnetic pulses that turned his cybernetic replacements against him. Dawn lasted longer, his defensive abilities keeping him in the fight until the Emperor's power finally broke through his guard. Sanguinius fought with the fury of an angel cast down from paradise, but even his speed and grace could not match the being who had created him. In the end, it was Horus alone who faced the Emperor in the ruins of the throne room. The War Master stood amid the bodies of his fallen brothers, his armor cracked and his weapons broken, facing the being who had shaped him into the perfect tool, and then discarded him when his usefulness ended. "You could have been magnificent," the Emperor said, his voice carrying genuine regret beneath the cold calculation. "All of you. In another age, under different circumstances, you could have been the heroes of humanity rather than its martyrs. Instead, we are your victims," Horus replied, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and loss, "murdered by the father who should have protected us. Sacrificed for the greater good. There is a difference, though I understand why you might not see it." The Emperor raised his hand, power gathering for the final blow. "History will remember you as heroes who fell to corruption, not as tools that outlived their usefulness. Your sacrifice will serve humanity long after your deaths are forgotten." The golden light filled the chamber, and the last War Master of the Great Crusade fell to the floor of the throne room, his rebellion ended, and his purpose finally complete. But as the Emperor stood over the bodies of his fallen sons, something in the shadows of the chamber began to laugh. The chaos corruption that had claimed some of the Primarchs had not died with their rebellion. It had been waiting for this moment, when the Emperor's guard was down and his attention focused on the immediate threat. The final gambit had failed, but in its failure, it had created opportunities that neither side had anticipated. The true war for the soul of humanity was just beginning. Chapter 12. Aftermath. 6 months after the fall of Terra, the galaxy bore scars that would never fully heal. The Imperial Palace lay in ruins, its golden spires twisted into monuments of betrayal and loss. The Emperor's broken form remained sealed within the Golden Throne, maintained by life support systems that drew power from the very Webway project he had died trying to complete. His psychic presence still flickered through the immaterium, but it was diminished, fractured, a shadow of the overwhelming authority that had once commanded the loyalty of 1,000,000 worlds. Malcador the Sigillite stood before the throne, his ancient features bearing the weight of decisions that had reshaped human civilization. The rebellion had failed in its immediate objectives. The Primarchs were dead, their legions scattered or destroyed, their vision of transhuman leadership reduced to ash and memory. But in failing, it had accomplished something neither side had anticipated. It had shattered the myth of imperial unity and revealed the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the Emperor's vision. "The reports from the outer sectors are consistent," he told the shadowy council that now governed what remained of the Imperium. "Planetary governors are declaring independence. Sector commanders are establishing autonomous zones. The Space Marine chapters that survived the purges are fragmenting along ideological lines. The members of the Council, high-ranking administratum officials, military commanders, and representatives of the various imperial institutions, listened with expressions that mixed relief with growing concern. They had survived the transition to purely human governance, but the empire they now ruled was fracturing faster than they could hold it together. "What of the surviving Primarchs?" asked Admiral Torbeck, commander of what remained of the Imperial Navy. "Intelligence reports suggest that some escaped the final assault on Terra. Magnus the Red has established a domain in the Sortiarius sector. His forces are changed, corrupted by warp energies that make conventional military response inadvisable." Malcador consulted data slates that documented the galaxy's new reality. Corvus Corax continues guerrilla operations against Imperial installations, but his activities are fragmented and lack strategic coherence. And the others? Alpharius and Omegon remain unaccounted for. Khan disappeared into the outer rim with elements of the White Scars. Mortarion has claimed dominion over several plague worlds in the galactic north. The Sigillite set down his reports and looked at each council member in turn. "We must accept the reality that the galaxy is no longer under unified imperial control." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. The Great Crusade had been launched to reunite humanity under a single government, to create an empire that would last for millennia. Instead, it had ended with the Emperor crippled, his sons dead or turned against him, and human civilization fragmenting into competing successor states. "What are our options?" asked General Kroger, head of Imperial Army Operations. "We consolidate what we can hold and prepare for a long period of competition with emerging rival powers," Malcador replied. "The dream of galactic unity died with the Emperor's injuries. Our goal now must be ensuring that some remnant of imperial civilization survives to carry forward the best aspects of his vision." On distant Ultramar, Robut Guilliman stood before a different council in the fortress monastery of Macraga. The 13th Primarch had not been present at the final assault on Terra. His duties administering the 500 worlds had kept him away from the conspiracy that had consumed his brothers. Now he faced the aftermath as the only loyalist Primarch to survive the purges intact. The Emperor's betrayal changes everything, he told his assembled advisors. We can no longer pretend that imperial authority represents the interests of the governed. We must build something new, something that honors the best of what the Imperium could have been, while rejecting the authoritarianism that led to its downfall. The men and women gathered around his council table, chapter masters, planetary governors, administrative officials, looked to him with expressions that mixed hope with uncertainty. Guilliman had always been the most administrative of the Primarchs, the one most concerned with governance and civil organization. If anyone could create stability from the chaos that had consumed the galaxy, it would be him. "You're proposing secession?" asked Chapter Master Calgar of the Ultramarine Second Company. "I'm proposing evolution. The Imperium, as conceived by the Emperor, was always unsustainable, a tyrannical structure that depended on the absolute loyalty of superhuman leaders who were themselves planned for disposal. We have the opportunity to create something better." Guilliman activated a holographic display showing the territory under his control, a confederation of worlds united by common purpose rather than fear, a government that serves its citizens rather than exploiting them. The discussions that followed would reshape the nature of human civilization. Ultramar became the seed of what historians would later call the Second Imperium, a federal structure that preserved the best aspects of imperial technology and organization while rejecting the authoritarian excesses that had led to the Primarch Rebellion. In the Eye of Terror, Magnus the Red sat upon a crystal throne that existed simultaneously in real space and the Immaterium. The power of chaos flowed through him like blood through veins, transforming his physical form and expanding his consciousness beyond the limitations of purely material existence. Around him, the remnants of the 1,000 Suns pursued studies that would have been branded heretical during the days of the Great Crusade. The Emperor's greatest mistake was believing that he could control forces beyond his understanding, Magnus told his assembled sorcerers. He made bargains with powers older than human civilization, and then believed he could renege on his agreements without consequence. The hall where they gathered existed in defiance of natural law. Its architecture shifted according to mathematical principles that mortal minds could not comprehend, its walls decorated with formulae that described the fundamental structure of reality itself. This was what humanity could become when freed from the Emperor's restrictions on psychic development. But they would also open doorways that could not be closed, summon entities that could not be banished, and unleash consequences that would ripple across the galaxy for millennia to come. On the cemetery world of Certus Minor, a solitary figure knelt among graves that stretched to the horizon. Vulcan had survived the final assault on Terra, but only barely. The cybernetic systems that had replaced much of his organic body had been damaged beyond repair, and his enhanced physiology was failing despite the best efforts of his remaining techmarines. Before him lay the tomb of Ferrus Manus, marked with a simple inscription: Brother, Father, Protector. Similar monuments dotted the cemetery, memorials to Horus, Sanguinius, Dawn, and all the others who had fallen in the rebellion against their creator. "The price was too high," Vulcan said to the empty air, his mechanical voice carrying across the silent graves. "We saved ourselves from planned termination, but we destroyed everything we had built together." His legion had scattered after the rebellion. Some had followed other Primarchs into exile or corruption. Others had tried to maintain their traditions within Guilliman's growing confederation. A few remained with him here, tending the monuments and preserving the memory of what they had once been. Did we choose correctly? The question was addressed to his fallen brothers, to the empty sky, to whatever gods might be listening. Could we have found another way? The graves offered no answers. The dead kept their silence, and Vulcan was left to wrestle with the knowledge that their victory had been Pyrrhic. They had prevented their own execution, but at the cost of everything they had fought to protect. In the depths of space, far from any star or world, a ship drifted through the void. The Invincible Reason bore the scars of the rebellion, its hull marked by weapons that had been designed specifically to kill Primarchs. Inside its command chamber, Lion L. Johnson stood before tactical displays that showed the galaxy's new configuration. He had chosen loyalty to the Emperor over solidarity with his brothers, and that choice haunted him now. The evidence of the planned termination had been undeniable, but his sense of duty had demanded that he report the conspiracy rather than join it. Now he was the last truly loyal Primarch, commander of a legion that had remained faithful while their galaxy burned. "My lord," said his seneschal, a space marine whose loyalties had never wavered despite the revelations about the Emperor's true nature. "We have received communication from Ultramar. Lord Guilliman requests an audience." The Lion was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Guilliman represented the future, a new form of human governance that tried to preserve the best of the imperial system while rejecting its authoritarian excesses. But accepting Guilliman's invitation would be an implicit acknowledgement that the old order was truly dead. "Tell him I will consider his proposal," the Lion said finally. "But first, we have other business to attend to." The displays showed the location of Magnus's domain in the Eye of Terror, Corvus Corax's latest guerrilla strike, the growing power of warlords and separatists across the galaxy. The Imperium had fragmented, but that did not mean its enemies had disappeared. If anything, the chaos that followed the rebellion had given rise to threats that would require coordinated response. Perhaps there was still a role for the last loyal son of the Emperor. Perhaps the bonds of brotherhood could be rebuilt on new foundations, stronger for having been tested by betrayal and loss. In the ruins of the Imperial Palace, scribes and chroniclers worked to compile the official history of the Primarch Rebellion. Their accounts would shape how future generations understood the events that had shattered the Great Crusade and transformed human civilization. The Emperor's version of events was already being circulated, a tragic tale of sons who fell to corruption and turned against their father, forcing him to take defensive action that ultimately cost him his life and the unity of his empire. It was a story that painted the rebellion as the result of chaos influence, rather than justified resistance to planned murder. But other accounts were being written in secret, testimonies from survivors who had witnessed the truth behind the rebellion. Documents smuggled from imperial archives that revealed the systematic nature of the planned termination. Evidence that the Primarchs had been victims rather than villains, tools marked for disposal when their usefulness ended. These competing narratives would shape the galaxy's future as much as any military conquest or political reorganization. The truth about the Emperor's true nature had been revealed, and no amount of official propaganda could completely suppress the knowledge of what he had planned for his sons. Humanity had learned that even gods could be tyrants, that even fathers could betray their children, that even the most noble causes could conceal the darkest purposes. These lessons would influence every government that arose from the ashes of the Imperium, every leader who sought to unite human worlds under their authority. The Great Crusade was over. The age of the Imperium had ended before it had truly begun. In its place rose something more complex, more dangerous, but potentially more honest. A galaxy where power was distributed rather than concentrated, where authority had to be earned rather than imposed, where the price of unity was acknowledged rather than hidden. It was not the future that the Emperor had envisioned. It was not the destiny that the Primarchs had dreamed of when they first took up arms in service to their father's cause. But it was the future they had chosen, through their rebellion and their sacrifice, their corruption and their loyalty, their victories and their defeats. A galaxy shaped by the knowledge that even the most perfect tools could choose to break rather than serve a purpose that denied their right to exist. The stars looked down on worlds where humans struggled to build something new from the ashes of the old. And in that struggle, in that refusal to accept easy answers or simple loyalties, perhaps they had found something more valuable than unity. They had found the courage to choose their own destiny, whatever the cost might be.